The Adventure of the Solitary Cyclist by Arthur Conan Doyle. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Peter Thomlinson, London, January 2017. From the years 1894 to 1901 inclusive, Mr. Sherlock Holmes was a very busy man. It is safe to say that there was no public case of any difficulty in which he was not consulted during those 8 years, and there were hundreds of private cases, some of them of the most intricate and extraordinary character, in which he played a prominent part. Many startling successes and a few unavoidable failures were the outcome of this long period of continuous work. As I have preserved very full notes of all these cases, and was myself personally engaged in many of them, it may be imagined that it is no easy task to know which I should select to lay before the public. I shall, however, preserve my former rule and give the preference to those cases which derive their interest not so much from the brutality of the crime as from the ingenuity and dramatic quality of the solution. For this reason I will now lay before the reader the facts connected with Miss Violet Smith, the solitary cyclist of Charlington, and the curious sequel of our investigations, which culminated in unexpected tragedy. It is true that the circumstances did not admit of any striking illustration of those powers for which my friend was famous, but there were some points about the case which made it stand out in those long records of crime from which I gather the material for these little narratives. On referring to my notebook for the year 1895, I found that it was upon Saturday, the 23rd of April, that we first heard of Miss Violet Smith. Her visit was, I remember, extremely unwelcome to Holmes, for he was immersed at that moment in a very abstruse and complicated problem concerning the peculiar persecution to which John Vincent Harden, the well-known tobacco millionaire, had been subjected. My friend, who loved above all things precision and concentration of thought, resented anything which distracted his attention from the matter in hand. And yet, without a harshness which was foreign to his nature, it was impossible to refuse to listen to the story of the young and beautiful woman, tall, graceful, and queenly, who presented herself at Baker Street late in the evening and implored his assistance and advice. It was vain to urge that his time was already fully occupied, for the young lady had come with the determination to tell her story, and it was evident that nothing short of force could get her out of the room until she had done so. With a resigned air and a somewhat weary smile, Holmes begged the beautiful intruder to take a seat and to inform us what it was that was troubling her. "At least it cannot be your health," said he, as his keen eyes darted over her. "So ardent a bicyclist must be full of energy." She glanced down in surprise at her own feet, and I observed the slight roughening of the side of the sole caused by the friction of the edge of the pedal. "Yes, I bicycle a good deal, Mr. Holmes, and that has something to do with my visit to you today." My friend took the lady's ungloved hand and examined it with as close an attention and as little sentiment as a scientist would show to a specimen. "You will excuse me, I am sure. It is my business," said he as he dropped it. "I nearly fell into the error of supposing that you were typewriting. Of course, it is obvious that it is music. You observe the spatulate finger end, Watson, which is common to both professions. There is a spirituality about the face, however," he gently turned it towards the light, "which the typewriter does not generate. This lady is a musician." "Yes, Mr. Holmes, I teach music." "In the country, I presume, from your complexion?" "Yes, sir, near Farnham, on the borders of Surrey. A beautiful neighbourhood and full of the most interesting associations. You remember, Watson, that it was near there that we took Archie Stamford, the forger. Now, Miss Violet, what has happened to you near Farnham on the borders of Surrey?" The young lady, with great clearness and composure, made the following curious statement. My father is dead, Mr. Holmes. He was James Smith, who conducted the orchestra at the Old Imperial Theatre. My mother and I were left without a relation in the world except one uncle, Ralph Smith, who went to Africa 25 years ago, and we have never had a word from him since. When father died, we were left very poor, but one day we were told that there was an advertisement in the Times inquiring for our whereabouts. You can imagine how excited we were, for we thought that someone had left us a fortune. We went at once to the lawyer whose name was given in the paper. There we met two gentlemen, Mr. Carruthers and Mr. Woodley, who were home on a visit from South Africa. They said that my uncle was a friend of theirs, and he died some months before in great poverty in Johannesburg, and that he had asked them with his last breath to hunt up his relations and see that they were in no want. It seemed strange to us that Uncle Ralph, who took no notice of us when he was alive, should be so careful to look after us when he was dead. But Mr. Carruthers explained that the reason was that my uncle had just heard of the death of his brother, and so felt responsible for our fate. "Excuse me," said Holmes, "when was this interview?" "Last December, 4 months ago." "Pray proceed." "Mr. Woodley seemed to me to be a most odious person. He was for ever making eyes at me, a coarse, puffy-faced, red-moustached young man, with his hair plastered down on each side of his forehead. I thought that he was perfectly hateful, and I was sure that Cyril would not wish me to know such a person." "Oh, Cyril is his name," said Holmes, smiling. The young lady blushed and laughed. "Yes, Mr. Holmes, Cyril Morton, an electrical engineer, and we hope to be married at the end of the summer." Dear me, how did I get talking about him? What I wished to say was that Mr. Woodley was perfectly odious, but that Mr. Carruthers, who was a much older man, was more agreeable. He was a dark, sallow, clean-shaven, silent person, but he had polite manners and a pleasant smile. He inquired how we were left, and on finding that we were very poor, he suggested that I should come and teach music to his only daughter, aged 10. I said that I did not like to leave my mother, on which he suggested that I should go home to her every week-end, and he offered me 100 a year, which was certainly splendid pay. So it ended by my accepting, and I went down to Chiltern Grange, about 6 miles from Farnham. Mr. Carruthers was a widower, but he had engaged a lady housekeeper, a very respectable elderly person called Mrs. Dixon, to look after his establishment. The child was a dear, and everything promised well. Mr. Carruthers was very kind and very musical, and we had most pleasant evenings together. Every week-end I went home to my mother in town. The first flaw in my happiness was the arrival of the red-moustached Mr. Woodley. He came for a visit of a week, and it seemed 3 months to me. He was a dreadful person, a bully to everyone else, but to me something infinitely worse. He made odious love to me, boasted of his wealth, said that if I married him I would have the finest diamonds in London, and finally, when I would have nothing to do with him, he seized me in his arms one day after dinner. He was hideously strong, and he swore that he would not let me go until I'd kissed him. Mr. Carruthers came in and tore him off me, on which he turned upon his own host, knocking him down and cutting his face open. That was the end of his visit, as you can imagine. Mr. Carruthers apologized to me next day, and assured me that I should never be exposed to such an insult again. I have not seen Mr. Woodley since. And now, Mr. Holmes, I come to the last special thing which has caused me to ask your advice today. You must know that every Saturday forenoon I ride on my bicycle to Farnham Station in order to get the 12:22 to town. The road from Chiltern Grange is a lonely one, and at one spot it is particularly so, for it lies for over a mile between Charlington Heath upon one side and the woods which lie around Charlington Hall upon the other. You could not find a more lonely tract of road anywhere, and it is quite rare to meet so much as a cart or a peasant until you reach the high road near Crooksbury Hill. 2 weeks ago I was passing this place when I chanced to look back over my shoulder, and about 200 yards behind me I saw a man, also on a bicycle. He seemed to be a middle-aged man with a short, dark beard. I looked back before I reached Farnham, but the man was gone, so I thought no more about it. But you can imagine how surprised I was, Mr. Holmes, when on my return on the Monday I saw the same man on the same stretch of road. My astonishment was increased when the incident occurred again, exactly as before, on the following Saturday and Monday. He always kept his distance and did not molest me in any way, but still it certainly was very odd. I mentioned it to Mr. Carruthers, who seemed interested in what I said, and told me that he had ordered a horse and trap so that in future I should not pass over these lonely roads without some companion. The horse and trap were to have come this week, but for some reason they were not delivered, and again I had to cycle to the station. That was this morning. You can think that I looked out when I came to Charlington Heath, and there, sure enough, was the man, exactly as he had been the 2 weeks before. He always kept so far from me that I could not clearly see his face, but it was certainly someone whom I did not know. He was dressed in a dark suit with a cloth cap. The only thing about his face that I could clearly see was his dark beard. Today I was not alarmed, but I was filled with curiosity, and I determined to find out who he was and what he wanted. I slowed down my machine, but he slowed down his. Then I stopped altogether, and he stopped also. Then I laid a trap for him. There was a sharp turning of the road, and I pedalled very quickly round this, and then I stopped and waited. I expected him to shoot round and pass me before he could stop, but he never appeared. Then I went back and looked round the corner. I could see a mile of road, but he was not on it. To make it more extraordinary, there was no side road at this point down which he could have gone. Holmes chuckled and rubbed his hands. "This case certainly presents some features of its own," said he. "How much time elapsed between your turning the corner and your discovery that the road was clear?" 2 or 3 minutes. "Then he could not have retreated down the road, and you say that there was no side roads?" "None." "Then he certainly took a footpath on one side or the other." "It could not have been on the side of the heath, or I should have seen him." So, by the process of exclusion, we arrive at the fact that he made his way towards Charlington Hall, which, as I understand, is situated in its own grounds on one side of the road. Anything else?" "Nothing, Mr. Holmes, save that I was so perplexed that I felt I should not be happy until I had seen you and had your advice." Holmes sat in silence for some little time. "Where is the gentleman to whom you are engaged?" he asked at last. "He is in the Midland Electrical Company at Coventry." "He would not pay you a surprise visit?" "Oh, Mr. Holmes, as if I should not know him." "Have you had any other admirers?" "Several before I knew Cyril." "And since?" "There was this dreadful man, Woodley, if you can call him an admirer." "No one else?" Our fair client seemed a little confused. "Who was he?" asked Holmes. "Oh, it may be a mere fancy of mine, but it has seemed to me sometimes that my employer, Mr. Carruthers, takes a great deal of interest in me. We are thrown rather together. I play his accompaniments in the evening. He has never said anything. He is a perfect gentleman, but a girl always knows." "Ah," Holmes looked grave. "What does he do for a living?" "He is a rich man." "No carriages or horses?" "Well, at least he is fairly well-to-do, but he goes into the city 2 or 3 times a week. He is deeply interested in South African gold shares." "You will let me know any fresh development, Miss Smith. I am very busy just now, but I will find time to make some inquiries into your case. In the meantime, take no step without letting me know. Good-bye, and I trust that we shall have nothing but good news from you." "It is a part of the settled order of nature that such a girl should have followers," said Holmes, as he pulled at his meditative pipe. "But for choice, not on bicycles, in lonely country roads. Some secretive lover beyond all doubt. But there are curious and suggestive details about the case, Watson. That he should appear only at that point." "Exactly. Our first effort must be to find who are the tenants of Charlington Hall. Then again, how about the connections between Carruthers and Woodley, since they appear to be men of such a different type? How come they both to be so keen upon looking out Ralph Smith's relations. One more point. What sort of a menage is it which pays double the market price for a governess, but does not keep a horse of those 6 miles from the station? Odd, Watson, very odd. You will go down? No, my dear fellow, you will go down. This may be some trifling intrigue, and I cannot break my other important research for the sake of it. On Monday you will arrive early at Farnham. You will conceal yourself near Charlington Heath, and you will observe these facts for yourself, and act as your own judgment advises. Then, having inquired as to the occupants of the hall, you will come back to me and report. And now, Watson, not another word of the matter until we have a few solid stepping stones on which we may hope to get across to our solution. We had ascertained from the lady that she went down upon the Monday by train which leaves Waterloo at 9:50. So I started early and caught the 9:13. At Farnham Station I had no difficulty in being directed to Charlington Heath. It was impossible to mistake the scene of the young lady's adventure, for the road runs between the open heath on one side and an old yew hedge upon the other, surrounding a park which is studded with magnificent trees. There was a main gateway of lichen-studded stone, each side pillar surmounted by mouldering heraldic emblems. But besides this central carriage drive, I observed several points where there were gaps in the hedge and paths leading through them. The house was invisible from the road, but the surroundings all spoke of gloom and decay. The heath was covered with golden patches of flowering gorse, gleaming magnificently in the light of the bright spring sunshine. Behind one of these clumps I took up my position so as to command both the gateway of the hall and a long stretch of the road upon either side. It had been deserted when I left it, but now I saw a cyclist riding down it from the opposite direction to that in which I had come. He was clad in a dark suit, and I saw that he had a black beard. On reaching the end of the Charlington grounds, he sprang from his machine and led it through a gap in the hedge, disappearing from my view. A quarter of an hour passed, and then a second cyclist appeared. This time it was the young lady coming from the station. I saw her look about her as she came to the Charlington hedge. An instant later the man emerged from his hiding-place, sprang upon his cycle, and followed her. In all the broad landscape those were the only moving figures, the graceful girl sitting very straight upon her machine, and the man behind her bending low over his handlebar, with a curiously furtive suggestion in every movement. She looked back at him and slowed her pace. He slowed also. She stopped. He at once stopped too, keeping 200 yards behind her. Her next movement was as unexpected as it was spirited. She suddenly whisked her wheels around and dashed straight at him. He was as quick as she, however, and darted off in desperate flight. Presently she came back up the road again, her head haughtily in the air, not deigning to take any further notice of her silent attendant. He had turned also, and still kept his distance until the curve of the road hid them from my sight. I remained in my hiding-place, and it was well that I did so, for presently the man reappeared, cycling slowly back. He turned in at the hall gates and dismounted from his machine. For some few minutes I could see him standing among the trees. His hands were raised, and he seemed to be settling his necktie. Then he mounted his cycle and rode away from me down the drive towards the hall. I ran across the heath and peered through the trees. Far away I could catch glimpses of the old grey building with its bristling Tudor chimneys, but the drive ran through a dense shrubbery, and I saw no more of my man. However, it seemed to me that I had done a fairly good morning's work, and I walked back in high spirits to Farnham. The local house agent could tell me nothing about Charlington Hall, and referred me to a well-known firm in Pall Mall. There I halted on my way home, and met with courtesy from the representative. No, I could not have Charlington Hall for the summer. I was just too late. It had been let about a month ago. Mr. Williamson was the name of the tenant. He was a respectable elderly gentleman. The polite agent was afraid he could say no more, as the affairs of his clients were not matters which he could discuss. Mr. Sherlock Holmes listened with attention to the long report which I was able to present to him that evening, but it did not elicit that word of curt praise which I had hoped for and should have valued. On the contrary, his austere face was even more severe than usual as he commented upon the things that I had done and the things I had not. "Your hiding-place, my dear Watson, was very faulty. You should have been behind the hedge. Then you would have had a close view of this interesting person. As it is, you were some hundreds of yards away and can tell me even less than Miss Smith. She thinks she does not know the man. I am convinced she does. Why otherwise should he be so desperately anxious that she should not get so near him as to see his features? You describe him as bending over the handlebar. Concealment again, you see. You really have done remarkably badly. He returns to the house and you want to find out who he is. You come to a London house agent." "What should I have done?" I cried with some heat. "Gone to the nearest public house. That is the centre of country gossip. They would have told you every name from the master to the scullery maid." "Williamson, it conveys nothing to my mind. If he is an elderly man, he is not this active cyclist who sprints away from that athletic young lady's pursuit. What have we gained by your expedition? The knowledge that the girl's story is true. I never doubted it. That there is a connection between the cyclist and the Hall. I never doubted that either. That the Hall is tenanted by Williamson. Who's the better for that? Well, well, my dear sir, don't look so depressed. We can do little more until next Saturday, and in the meantime I may make one or two inquiries myself." Next morning we had a note from Miss Smith recounting shortly and accurately the very incidents which I had seen, but the pith of the letter lay in the postscript. "I am sure that you will respect my confidence, Mr. Holmes, when I tell you that my place here has become difficult owing to the fact that my employer has proposed marriage to me. I am convinced that his feelings are most deep and most honourable. At the same time my promise is, of course, given. He took my refusal very seriously, but also very gently. You can understand, however, that the situation is a little strained." "Our young friend seems to be getting into deep waters," said Holmes, thoughtfully, as he finished the letter. "The case certainly presents more features of interest and more possibility of development than I had originally thought. I should be none the worse for a quiet, peaceful day in the country, and I am inclined to run down this afternoon and test one or two theories which I have formed." Holmes's quiet day in the country had a singular termination, for he arrived at Baker Street late in the evening with a cut lip and a discoloured lump upon his forehead, besides a general air of dissipation which should have made his own person the fitting object of a Scotland Yard investigation. He was immensely tickled by his own adventures and laughed heartily as he recounted them. "I get so little active exercise that is always a treat," said he. "You are aware that I have some proficiency in the good old British sport of boxing. Occasionally it is of service. Today, for example, I should have come to very ignominious grief without it." I begged him to tell me what had occurred. "I found that country pub which I had already recommended to your notice, and there I made my discreet inquiries. I was in the bar, and a garrulous landlord was giving me all that I wanted. Williamson is a white-bearded man, and he lives alone with a small staff of servants at the Hall. There is some rumour that he is, or has been, a clergyman, but one or two incidents of his short residence at the Hall struck me as peculiarly unecclesiastical. I have already made some inquiries at a clerical agency, and they tell me there was a man of that name in orders, whose career has been a singularly dark one. Further inform me that there are usually week-end visitors, a warm lot, sir, at the Hall, and especially one gentleman with a red moustache, Mr. Woodley by name, who was always there. We had got as far as this when who should walk in but the gentleman himself, who had been drinking his beer in the tap-room and who had heard the whole conversation. Who was I? What did I want? What did I mean by asking questions? He had a fine flow of language, and his adjectives were very vigorous. He ended a string of abuse by a vicious backhander which I failed to entirely avoid. The next few minutes were delicious. It was a straight left against a slogging ruffian. I emerged as you see me. Mr. Woodley went home in a cart. So ended my country trip, and it must be confessed that, however enjoyable, my day on the Surrey board has not been much more profitable than your own." The Thursday brought us another letter from our client. "You will not be surprised, Mr. Holmes," said she, "to hear that I am leaving Mr. Carruthers' employment. Even the high pay cannot reconcile me to the discomforts of my situation. On Saturday I come up to town, and I do not intend to return. Mr. Carruthers has got a trap, and so the dangers of the lonely road, if there ever were any dangers, are now over. As to the special cause of my leaving, it is not merely the strained situation with Mr. Carruthers, but it is the reappearance of that odious man, Mr. Woodley. He was always hideous, but he looks more awful than ever now, for he appears to have had an accident, and he is much disfigured. I saw him out of the window, but I am glad to say I did not meet him. He had a long talk with Mr. Carruthers, who seemed much excited afterwards. Woodley must be staying in the neighbourhood, for he did not sleep here, and yet I caught a glimpse of him again this morning, slinking about in the shrubbery. I would sooner have a savage wild animal loose about the place. I loathe and fear him more than I can say. How can Mr. Carruthers endure such a creature for a moment? However, all my troubles will be over on Saturday." "So I trust, Watson, so I trust," said Holmes gravely. "There is some deep intrigue going on around that little woman, and it is our duty to see that no one molests her upon that last journey. I think, Watson, that we must spare time to run down together on Saturday morning and make sure that this curious and inconclusive investigation has no untoward ending." I confess that I had not up to now taken a very serious view of the case, which had seemed to me rather grotesque and bizarre than dangerous. That a man should lie in wait for and follow a very handsome woman is no unheard of thing, and if he had so little audacity that he not only dared not address her, but even fled from her approach, he was not a very formidable assailant. The ruffian Woodley was a very different person, but, except on one occasion, he had not molested our client, and now he visited the house of Carruthers without intruding upon her presence. The man on the bicycle was doubtless a member of those week-end parties at the Hall of which the publican had spoken, but who he was or what he wanted was as obscure as ever. It was the severity of Holmes's manner and the fact that he slipped a revolver into his pocket before leaving our rooms which impressed me with the feeling that tragedy might prove to lurk behind the curious train of events. A rainy night had been followed by a glorious morning, and the heath-covered countryside with the glowing clumps of flowering gorse seemed all the more beautiful to the eyes which were weary of the duns and drabs and slate greys of London. Holmes and I walked along the broad, sandy road, inhaling the fresh morning air and rejoicing in the music of the birds and the fresh breath of the spring. From a rise of the road on the shoulder of Crookbury Hill we could see the grim Hall bristling out from amidst the ancient oaks, which, old as they were still younger than the building which they surrounded. Holmes pointed along the long tract of road which wound, a reddish-yellow band, between the brown of the heath and the budding green of the woods. Far away, a black dot, we could see a vehicle moving in our direction. Holmes gave an exclamation of impatience. "I had given a margin of half an hour," said he. "If that is her trap, she must be making for the earlier train. I fear, Watson, that she will be past Charlington before we can possibly meet her." From the instant that we passed the rise, we could no longer see the vehicle, but we hastened onwards at such a pace that my sedentary life began to tell upon me, and I was compelled to fall behind. Holmes, however, was always in training, for he had inexhaustible stores of nervous energy upon which to draw. His springy step never slowed until suddenly, when he was 100 yards in front of me, he halted, and I saw him throw up his hand with a gesture of grief and despair. At the same instant, an empty dog-cart, the horse cantering, the reins trailing, appeared round the curve of the road and rattled swiftly towards us. "Too late, Watson, too late!" cried Holmes, as I ran panting to his side. "Fool that I was not to allow for that earlier train. It's abduction, Watson, abduction, murder, heaven knows what. Block the road, stop the horse. That's right. Now jump in. Let us see if I can repair the consequences of my own blunder." We had sprung into the dog-cart, and Holmes, after turning the horse, gave a sharp cut with the whip, and we flew back along the road. As we turned the curve, the whole stretch of the road between the hall and the heath was opened up. I grasped Holmes's arm. "That's the man," I gasped. A solitary cyclist was coming towards us. His head was down and his shoulders rounded as he put every ounce of energy that he possessed onto the pedals. He was flying like a racer. Suddenly he raised his bearded face, saw us close to him, and pulled up, springing from his machine. The coal-black beard was in singular contrast to the pallor of his face, and his eyes were as bright as if he had a fever. He stared at us and at the dog-cart. Then a look of amazement came over his face. "Halloa! Stop there!" he shouted, holding his bicycle to block the road. "Where did you get that dog-cart? Pull up, man!" he yelled, drawing a pistol from his side pocket. "Pull up, I say, or by George, I'll put a bullet into your horse." Holmes threw the reins into my lap and sprang down from the cart. "You're the man we want to see. Where is Miss Violet Smith?" he said in his quick, clear way. "That's what I'm asking you. You're in her dog-cart. You ought to know where she is." "We met the dog-cart on the road. There was no one in it. We drove back to help the young lady." Good Lord, what shall I do?" cried the stranger in an ecstasy of despair. "They've got her, that hell-bound Woodley, and the blackguard parson. Come, man, come. If you really are her friend, stand by me and we'll save her if I have to leave my carcass in Charlington Wood." He ran distractedly, his pistol in his hand, towards a gap in the hedge. Holmes followed him, and I, leaving the horse grazing beside the road, followed Holmes. "This is where they came through," said he, pointing to the marks of several feet upon the muddy path. "Halloa, stop a minute. Who's this in the bush?" It was a young fellow about 17, dressed like an ostler, with leather cords and gaiters. He lay upon his back, his knees drawn up, a terrible cut upon his head. He was insensible, but alive. A glance at his wound told me that it had not penetrated the bone. "That's Peter the groom," cried the stranger. "He drove her. The beasts have pulled him off and clubbed him. Let him lie. We can't do him any good, but we may save her from the worst fate that can befall a woman." We ran frantically down the path which wound among the trees. We had reached the shrubbery which surrounded the house when Holmes pulled up. "They didn't go to the house. Here are their marks on the left. Here, beside the laurel bushes. Ah, I said so." As he spoke, a woman's shrill scream, a scream which vibrated with a frenzy of horror, burst from the thick green clump of bushes in front of us. It ended suddenly on its highest note with a choke and a gurgle. This way, they are in the bowling alley," cried the stranger, darting through the bushes. "Ah, the cowardly dogs! Follow me, gentlemen. Too late, by the living jingo." We had broken suddenly into a lovely glade of greenwood surrounded by ancient trees. On the farther side of it, under the shadow of a mighty oak, there stood a singular group of 3 people. One was a woman, our client, drooping and faint, a handkerchief round her mouth. Opposite her stood a brutal, heavy-faced, red-moustached young man, his gaitered legs parted wide, one arm akimbo, the other waving a riding-crop, his whole attitude suggestive of a triumphant bravado. Between them an elderly, grey-bearded man wearing a short surplice over a light tweed suit had evidently just completed the wedding service, for he pocketed his prayer book as we appeared, and slapped the sinister bridegroom upon the back in jovial congratulation. "They're married," I gasped. "Come on," cried our guide, "come on." He rushed across the glade, Holmes and I at his heels. As we approached, the lady staggered against the trunk of the tree for support. Williamson, the ex-clergyman, bowed to us with mock politeness, and the bully Woodley advanced with a shout of brutal and exultant laughter. "You can take your beard off, Bob," said he. "I know you right enough. Well, you and your pals have just come in time for me to be able to introduce you to Mrs. Woodley." Our guide's answer was a singular one. He snatched off the dark beard which had disguised him and threw it to the ground, disclosing a long, sallow, clean-shaven face below it. Then he raised his revolver and covered the young ruffian, who was advancing upon him with his dangerous riding-crop swinging from his hand. "Yes," said our ally, I am Bob Carruthers, and I'll see this woman righted if I have to swing for it. I told you what I'd do if you molested her, and, by the Lord, I'll be as good as my word. You're too late. She's my wife. No, she's your widow. His revolver cracked, and I saw the blood spurt from the front of Woodley's waistcoat. He spun round with a scream and fell upon his back, his hideous red face turning suddenly to a dreadful mottled pallor. The old man, still clad in his surplice, burst into such a string of foul oaths as I have never heard, and pulled out a revolver of his own. But before he could raise it, he was looking down the barrel of Holmes' weapon. "Enough of this," said my friend coldly. "Drop that pistol. Watson, pick it up. Hold it to his head. Thank you. You, Carruthers, give me that revolver. We'll have no more violence. Come on, hand it over. Who are you, then?" "My name is Sherlock Holmes." "Good Lord!" "You have heard of me, I see. I will represent the official police until they arrive. Here, you!" he shouted to a frightened groom who had appeared at the edge of the glade. "Come here, take this note as hard as you can, ride to Farnham." He scribbled a few words upon a leaf from his notebook. "Give it to the superintendent at the police station. Until he comes, I must detain you all under my personal custody." The strong, masterful personality of Holmes dominated the tragic scene, and all were equally puppets in his hands. Williamson and Carruthers found themselves carrying the wounded Woodley into the house, and I gave my arm to the frightened girl. The injured man was laid on his bed, and at Holmes's request I examined him. I carried my report to where he sat in the old tapestry-hung dining-room, with his two prisoners before him. "He will live," said I. "What?" said Carruthers, springing out of his chair. "I'll go upstairs and finish him first. Do you tell me that girl, that angel, is to be tied to Roaring Jack Woodley for life?" "You need not concern yourself about that," said Holmes. "There are two very good reasons why she should, under no circumstances, be his wife. In the first place, we are very safe in questioning Mr. Williamson's right to solemnize a marriage." "I have been ordained," cried the old rascal, "and also unfrocked." "Once a clergyman, always a clergyman." "I think not. How about the license?" "We had a license for the marriage. I have it here in my pocket." "Then you got it by a trick. But in any case, a forced marriage is no marriage, but it is a very serious felony, as you will discover before you have finished. You'll have time to think that point out during the next 10 years or so, unless I am mistaken. As to you, Carruthers, you would have done better to keep your pistol in your pocket." "I begin to think so, Mr. Holmes, but when I thought of all the precaution I had taken to shield this girl, for I loved her, Mr. Holmes, and it is the only time that ever I knew what love was, it fairly drove me mad to think that she was in the power of the greatest brute and bully in South Africa, a man whose name is a holy terror from Kimberley to Johannesburg. Why, Mr. Holmes, you'll hardly believe it, but ever since that girl has been in my employment, I never once let her go past this house, where I knew these rascals were lurking, without following her on my bicycle, just to see that she came to no harm. I kept my distance from her, and I wore a beard so that she should not recognize me, for she is a good and high-spirited girl, and she wouldn't have stayed in my employment long if she had thought I was following her about the country roads." "Why didn't you tell her of her danger?" "Because then again she would have left me, and I couldn't bear to face that. Even if she couldn't love me, it was a great deal to me just to see her dainty form about the house and to hear the sound of her voice." "Well," said I, "you call that love, Mr. Carruthers, but I should call it selfishness. Maybe the two things go together. Anyhow, I couldn't let her go. Besides, with this crowd about, it was well that she should have someone near to look after her. Then when the cable came, I knew they were bound to make a move." "What cable?" Carruthers took a telegram from his pocket. "That's it," said he. It was short and concise. "The old man is dead." Said Holmes. "I think I see how things worked, and I can understand how this message would, as you say, bring them to a head. But while we wait, you might tell me what you can." The old reprobate with the surplice burst into a volley of bad language. "By heaven," said he, "if you squeal on us, Bob Carruthers, I'll serve you as you served Jack Woodley." You can bleat about the girl to your heart's content, for that's your own affair. But if you round on your pals to this plain-clothes copper, it will be the worst day's work that you ever did." "Your reverence need not be excited," said Holmes, lighting a cigarette. "The case is clear enough against you, and all I ask is a few details for my private curiosity. However, if there's any difficulty in your telling me, I'll do the talking, and then you will see how far you have a chance of holding back your secrets. In the first place, 3 of you came from South Africa on this game. You, Williamson, you, Carruthers, and Woodley." "Lie number 1," said the old man. "I never saw either of them until 2 months ago, and I'd never been in Africa in my life, so you can put all that in your pipe and smoke it, Mr. Busybody Holmes." "What he says is true," said Carruthers. Well, 2 of you came over. His reverence is our own home-made article. You had known Ralph Smith in South Africa. You had a reason to believe he would not live long. You found out that his niece would inherit his fortune. How's that, eh?" Carruthers nodded and Williamson swore. "She was next of kin, no doubt, and you were aware that the old fellow would make no will." "Couldn't read or write," said Carruthers. "So you came over, the 2 of you, and hunted up the girl. The idea was that one of you was to marry her and the other have a share of the plunder. For some reason Woodley was chosen as the husband. Why was that?" "We played cards for her on the voyage. He won." "I see. You got the young lady into your service, and there Woodley was to do the courting. She recognized the drunken brute that he was, and would have nothing to do with him. Meanwhile, your arrangements was rather upset by the fact that you had yourself fallen in love with the lady. You could no longer bear the idea of this ruffian owning her." "No, by George, I couldn't." "There was a quarrel between you. He left you in a rage and began to make his own plans independently of you." "It strikes me, Williamson, there isn't very much that we can tell this gentleman," cried Carruthers, with a bitter laugh. "Yes, we quarrelled, and he knocked me down. I am level with him on that, anyhow. Then I lost sight of him. That was when he picked up with this cast padre here. I found that they had set up housekeeping together at this place on the line that she had to pass for the station. I kept my eye on her after that, for I knew there was some devilry in the wind. I saw them from time to time, for I was anxious to know what they were after. 2 days ago Woodley came up to my house with this cable, which showed that Ralph Smith was dead. He asked me if I would stand by the bargain, and I said I would not. He asked me if I would marry the girl myself and give him a share. I said I would willingly do so, but that she would not have me. He said, 'Let us get her married first, and after a week or 2 she may see things a bit different.' I said I would have nothing to do with violence. So he went off cursing, like the foul-mouthed blackguard that he was, and swearing that he would have her yet. She was leaving me this weekend, and I had got a trap to take her to the station, but I was so uneasy in my mind that I followed her on my bicycle. She had got a start, however, and before I could catch her, the mischief was done. The first thing I knew about it was when I saw you 2 gentlemen driving back in her dog-cart." Holmes rose and tossed the end of his cigarette into the grate. "I've been very obtuse, Watson," said he. "When in your report you said that you had seen the cyclist, as you thought, arrange his necktie in the shrubbery, that alone should have told me all. However, we may congratulate ourselves upon a curious and, in some respects, a unique case. I perceive 3 of the county constabulary in the drive, and I am glad to see that the little ostler is able to keep pace with them. So it is unlikely that neither he nor the interesting bridegroom will be permanently damaged by their morning's adventures. I think, Watson, that in your medical capacity you might wait upon Miss Smith and tell her that if she is sufficiently recovered, we shall be happy to escort her to her mother's home. If she is not quite convalescent, you will find that a hint that we were about to telegraph to a young electrician in the Midlands would probably complete the cure. As to you, Mr. Carruthers, I think that you have done what you could to make amends for your share in an evil plot. There is my card, sir, and if my evidence can be of help to you in your trial, it shall be at your disposal." In the world of our incessant activity, it has often been difficult for me, as the reader has probably observed, to round off my narratives and to give those final details which the curious might expect. Each case has been the prelude to another, and the crisis once over, the actors have passed for ever out of our busy lives. I find, however, a short note at the end of my manuscripts dealing with this case, in which I have put it upon record that Miss Violet Smith did indeed inherit a large fortune, and that she is now the wife of Cyril Morton, the senior partner of Morton and Kennedy, the famous Westminster electricians. Williamson and Woodley were both tried for abduction and assault, the former getting 7 years and the latter 10. Of the fate of Carruthers I have no record, but I am sure that his assault was not viewed very gravely by the court, since Woodley had the reputation of being a most dangerous ruffian, and I think that a few months were sufficient to satisfy the demands of justice. End of The Adventure of the Solitary Cyclist by Arthur Conan Doyle. The Three Tools of Death by G.K. Chesterton. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Peter Thomlinson, London, March 2017. Both by calling and conviction, Father Brown knew better than most of us that every man is dignified when he is dead. But even he felt a pang of incongruity when he was knocked up at daybreak and told that Sir Aaron Armstrong had been murdered. There was something absurd and unseemly about secret violence in connection with so entirely entertaining and popular a figure. For Sir Aaron Armstrong was entertaining to the point of being comic, and popular in such a manner as to be almost legendary. It was like hearing that Sonny Jim had hanged himself, or that Mr. Pickwick had died in Hanwell. For though Sir Aaron was a philanthropist, and thus dealt with the darker side of our society, he prided himself on dealing with it in the brightest possible style. His political and social speeches were cataracts of anecdotes and loud laughter. His bodily health was of a bursting sort, his ethics were all optimism, and he dealt with the drink problem, his favourite topic, with that immortal or even monotonous gaiety which is so often a mark of the prosperous total abstainer. The established story of his conversation was familiar on the more puritanic platforms and pulpits, how he had been, when only a boy, drawn away from Scotch theology to Scotch whisky, and how he had risen out of both and become, as he modestly put it, what he was. Yet his wide and white beard, cherubic face, and sparkling spectacles at the numberless dinners and congresses where they appeared made it hard to believe, somehow, that he'd ever been anything so morbid as either a dram drinker or a Calvinist. He was, one felt, the most seriously merry of all the sons of men. He had lived in the rural skirt of Hampstead in a handsome house, high but not broad, a modern and prosaic tower. The narrowest of its narrow sides overhung the steep green bank of a railway and was shaken by passing trains. Sir Aaron Armstrong, as he boisterously explained, had no nerves. But if the train had often given a shock to the house, that morning the tables were turned, and it was the house that gave a shock to the train. The engine slowed down and stopped just beyond that point where an angle of the house impinged upon the sharp slope of turf. The arrest of most mechanical things must be slow, but the living cause of this had been very rapid. A man clad completely in black, even, it was remembered, to the dreadful detail of black gloves, appeared on the ridge above the engine and waved his black hands like some sable windmill. This in itself would hardly have stopped even a lingering train, but there came out of him a cry which was talked of afterwards as something utterly unnatural and new. It was one of those shouts that are horribly distinct even when we cannot hear what is shouted. The word in this case was murder. But the engine driver swears he would have pulled up just the same if he had heard only the dreadful and definite accent and not the word. The train, once arrested, the most superficial stare could take in many features of the tragedy. The man in black on the green bank was Sir Aaron Armstrong's manservant Magnus. The baronet, in his optimism, had often laughed at the black gloves of this dismal attendant, but no one was likely to laugh at him just now. So soon as an inquirer or two had stepped off the line and across the smoky hedge, they saw, rolled down almost to the bottom of the bank, the body of an old man in a yellow dressing gown with a very vivid scarlet lining. A scrap of rope seemed caught about his leg, entangled presumably in a struggle. There was a smear or so of blood, though very little, but the body was bent or broken into a posture impossible to any living thing. It was Sir Aaron Armstrong. A few more bewildered moments brought out a big, fair-bearded man, whom some travellers could salute as the dead man's secretary, Patrick Royce, once well known in Bohemian society and even famous in the Bohemian arts. In a manner more vague, but even more convincing, he echoed the agony of the servant. By the time the third figure of that household, Alice Armstrong, daughter of the dead man, had come already tottering and waving into the garden, the engine driver had put a stop to his stoppage. The whistle had blown, and the train had panted on to get help from the next station. Father Brown had been thus rapidly summoned at the request of Patrick Royce, the big ex-Bohemian secretary. Royce was an Irishman by birth, and that casual kind of Catholic that never remembers his religion until he's really in a hole. But Royce's request might have been less promptly complied with if one of the official detectives had not been a friend and admirer of the unofficial Flambeau, and it was impossible to be a friend of Flambeau without hearing numberless stories about Father Brown. Hence, while the young detective, whose name was Merton, led the little priest across the fields to the railway, their talk was more confidential than could be expected between two total strangers. "As far as I can see," said Mr. Merton candidly, "there is no sense to be made of it at all. There is nobody one can suspect. Magnus is a solemn old fool, far too much of a fool to be an assassin. Royce has been the baronet's best friend for years, and his daughter undoubtedly adored him. Besides, it's all too absurd. Who would kill such a cheery old chap as Armstrong? Who could dip his hands in the gore of an after-dinner speaker? It would be like killing Father Christmas." "Yes, it was a cheery house," assented Father Brown. "It was a cheery house while he was alive. Do you think it will be cheery now he is dead?" Merton started a little and regarded his companion with an enlivened eye. "Now he is dead?" he repeated. "Yes," continued the priest stolidly. "He was cheerful, but did he communicate his cheerfulness? Frankly, was anyone else in the house cheerful but he?" A window in Merton's mind let in that strange light of surprise in which we see for the first time things we have known all along. He had often been to the Armstrongs on little police jobs of the philanthropist, and now he came to think of it, it was in itself a depressing house. The rooms were very high and very cold, the decoration mean and provincial. The draughty corridors were lit by electricity that was bleaker than moonlight. And though the old man's scarlet face and silver beard had blazed like a bonfire in each room or passage in turn, it did not leave any warmth behind it. Doubtless this spectral discomfort in the place was partly due to the very vitality and exuberance of its owner. He needed no stoves or lamps, he would say, but carried his own warmth with him. But when Merton recalled the other inmates, he was compelled to confess that they also were as shadows of their lord. The moody manservant with his monstrous black gloves was almost a nightmare. Royce, the secretary, was solid enough, a big bull of a man in tweeds, with a short beard, but the straw-coloured beard was startlingly salted with grey like the tweed, and the broad forehead was barred with premature wrinkles. He was good-natured enough also, but it was a sad sort of good-nature, almost a heartbroken sort. He had the general air of being some sort of failure in life. As for Armstrong's daughter, it was almost incredible that she was his daughter. She was so pallid in colour and sensitive in outline. She was graceful, but there was a quiver in the very shape of her that was like the lines of an aspen. Merton had sometimes wondered if she had learnt to quail at the crash of the passing trains. "You see," said Father Brown, blinking modestly, "I am not sure that the Armstrong cheerfulness is so very cheerful for other people. You say that nobody could kill such a happy old man, but I'm not sure. Ne nos inducas in tentationem. If I ever murdered somebody," he added quite simply, "I dare say it might be an optimist." "Why?" cried Merton, amused. "Do you think people dislike cheerfulness?" "People like frequent laughter," answered Father Brown, "but I don't think they like a permanent smile. Cheerfulness without humour is a very trying thing." They walked some way in silence along the windy, grassy bank by the rail, and just as they came under the far-flung shadow of the tall Armstrong house, Father Brown said suddenly, like a man throwing away a troublesome thought rather than offering it seriously, "Of course, drink is neither good nor bad in itself, but I can't help sometimes feeling that men like Armstrong want an occasional glass of wine to sadden them." Merton's official superior, a grizzled and capable detective named Gilder, was standing on the green bank waiting for the coroner, talking to Patrick Royce, whose big shoulders and bristly beard and hair towered above him. This was the more noticeable because Royce walked always with a sort of powerful stoop and seemed to be going about his small clerical and domestic duties in a heavy and humbled style, like a buffalo drawing a go-cart. He raised his head with unusual pleasure at the sight of the priest, and took him a few paces apart. Meanwhile Merton was addressing the older detective respectfully indeed, but not without a certain boyish impatience. "Well, Mr. Gilder, have you got much farther with the mystery?" "There is no mystery," replied Gilder, as he looked under dreamy eyelids at the rooks. "Well, there is for me, at any rate," said Merton, smiling. "It is simple enough, my boy," observed the senior investigator, stroking his grey, pointed beard. 3 minutes after you had gone for Mr. Royce's parson, the whole thing came out. You know that pasty-faced servant in the black gloves who stopped the train? I should know him anywhere. Somehow he rather gives me the creeps." "Well," drawled Gilder, "when the train had gone on again, that man had gone too. Rather a cool criminal, don't you think, to escape by the very train that went off for the police?" "You're pretty sure, I suppose," remarked the young man, "that he really did kill his master?" "Yes, my son, I'm pretty sure," replied Gilder dryly, "for the trifling reason that he has gone off with £20,000 in papers that were in his master's desk. No, the only thing worth calling a difficulty is how he killed him. The skull seems broken as with some big weapon, but there's no weapon at all lying about, and the murderer would have found it awkward to carry it away, unless the weapon was too small to be noticed." "Perhaps the weapon was too big to be noticed," said the priest, with an odd little giggle. Gilder looked around at this wild remark, and rather sternly asked Brown what he meant. "Silly way of putting it, I know," said Father Brown apologetically. "Sounds like a fairy tale. But poor Armstrong was killed with a giant's club, a great green club, too big to be seen, and which we call the earth. He was broken against this green bank we are standing on." "How do you mean?" asked the detective quickly. Father Brown turned his moon face up to the narrow facade of the house and blinked hopelessly up. Following his eyes, they saw that right at the top of this otherwise blind back quarter of the building, an attic window stood open. "Don't you see?" he explained, pointing a little awkwardly like a child. "He was thrown down from there." Gilder frowningly scrutinized the window and then said, "Well, it is certainly possible, but I don't see why you are so sure about it." Brown opened his grey eyes wide. "Why," he said, "there's a bit of rope round the dead man's leg. Don't you see that other bit of rope up there caught at the corner of the window? At that height the thing looked like the faintest particle of dust or hair." But the shrewd old investigator was satisfied. "You're quite right, sir," he said to Father Brown. "That is certainly one to you." Almost as he spoke, a special train with one carriage took the curve of the line on their left, and stopping disgorged another group of policemen, in whose midst was the hangdog visage of Magnus, the absconded servant. "By Jove, they've got him!" cried Gilder, and stepped forward with quite a new alertness. "Have you got the money?" he cried to the first policeman. The man looked him in the face with a rather curious expression and said, "No." Then he added, "At least, not here." "Which is the inspector, please?" asked the man called Magnus. When he spoke, everyone instantly understood how this voice had stopped a train. He was a dull-looking man with flat black hair, a colourless face, and a faint suggestion of the East in the level slits in his eyes and mouth. His blood and name, indeed, had remained dubious ever since Sir Aaron had rescued him from a waitership in a London restaurant, and, as some said, from more infamous things. But his voice was as vivid as his face was dead. Whether through exactitude in a foreign language or in deference to his master, who had been somewhat deaf, Magnus's tones had a peculiarly ringing and piercing quality, and the whole group quite jumped when he spoke. "I always knew this would happen," he said aloud with brazen blandness. "My poor old master made game of me for wearing black, but I always said I should be ready for his funeral." And he made a momentary movement with his two dark-gloved hands. "Sergeant," said Inspector Gilder, eyeing the black hands with wrath, "aren't you putting the bracelets on this fellow? He looks pretty dangerous." "Well, sir," said the sergeant, with the same odd look of wonder, "I don't know that we can." "What do you mean?" asked the other sharply. "Haven't you arrested him?" A faint scorn widened the slit-like mouth, and the whistle of an approaching train seemed oddly to echo the mockery. "We arrested him," replied the sergeant gravely, "just as he was coming out of the police station at Highgate, where he had deposited all his master's money in the care of Inspector Robinson." Gilder looked at the manservant in utter amazement. "Why on earth did you do that?" he asked of Magnus. "To keep it safe from the criminal, of course," replied that person placidly. "Surely," said Gilder, "Sir Aaron's money might have been safely left with Sir Aaron's family." The tail of his sentence was drowned in the roar of the train as it went rocking and clanking. But through all the hell of noises to which that unhappy house was periodically subject, they could hear the syllabuses of Magnus's answer in all their bell-like distinctness. "I have no reason to feel confidence in Sir Aaron's family." All the motionless men had the ghostly sensation of the presence of some new person, and Merton was scarcely surprised when he looked up and saw the pale face of Armstrong's daughter over Father Brown's shoulder. She was still young and beautiful in a silvery style, but her hair was of so dusty and hueless a brown that in some shadows it seemed to have turned totally grey. "Be careful what you say," said Royce gruffly. "You'll frighten Miss Armstrong." "I hope so," said the man with the clear voice. As the woman winced and everyone else wondered, he went on, "I am somewhat used to Miss Armstrong's tremors. I have seen her trembling off and on for years, and some said she was shaking with cold, and some she was shaking with fear. But I know she was shaking with hate and wicked anger, fiends that have had their feast this morning. She would have been away by now with her lover and all the money but for me, ever since my poor old master prevented her from marrying that tipsy blackguard. "Stop," said Gilder very sternly. "We have nothing to do with your family fancies or suspicions. Unless you have some practical evidence, your mere opinions—" "Oh, I'll give you practical evidence," cut in Magnus, in his hacking accent. "You have to subpoena me, Mr. Inspector, and I shall have to tell the truth. And the truth is this. An instant after the old man was pitched bleeding out of the window, I ran into the attic and found his daughter swooning on the floor with a red dagger still in her hand. Allow me to hand that also to the proper authorities." He took from his tail pocket a long, horn-hilted knife with the red smear on it, and handed it politely to the sergeant. Then he stood back again, and his slits of eyes almost faded from his face in one fat Chinese sneer. Merton felt an almost bodily sickness at the sight of him, and he muttered to Gilder, "Surely you would take Miss Armstrong's word against his?" Father Brown suddenly lifted a face so absurdly fresh that it looked somehow as if he had just washed it. "Yes," he said, radiating innocence. "But is Miss Armstrong's word against his?" The girl uttered a startled, singular little cry. Everyone looked at her. Her figure was rigid as if paralyzed. Only her face, within its frame of faint brown hair, was alive with an appalling surprise. She stood like one of a sudden lassoed and throttled. "This man," said Mr. Gilder gravely, "actually says that you were found grasping a knife, insensible, after the murder." "He says the truth," answered Alice. The next fact of which they were conscious was that Patrick Royce strode with his great stooping head into their ring and uttered the singular words, "Well, if I've got to go, I'll have a bit of pleasure first." His huge shoulder heaved, and he sent an iron fist smash into Magnus's bland Mongolian visage, laying him on the lawn as flat as a starfish. Two or three of the police instantly put their hands on Royce, but to the rest it seemed as if all reason had broken up and the universe were turning into a brainless harlequinade. "None of that, Mr. Royce," Gilder had called out authoritatively. "I shall arrest you for assault." "No, you won't," answered the secretary in a voice like an iron gong. "You will arrest me for murder." Gilder threw an alarmed glance at the man knocked down, but since that outraged person was already sitting up and wiping a little blood off a substantially uninjured face, he only said shortly, "What do you mean?" "It is quite true, as this fellow says," explained Royce, "that Miss Armstrong fainted with a knife in her hand. But she had not snatched the knife to attack her father, but to defend him." "To defend him," repeated Gilder gravely. "Against whom?" "Against me," answered the secretary. Alice looked at him with a complex and baffling face. Then she said in a low voice, "After it all, I am still glad you are brave." "Come upstairs," said Patrick Royce heavily, "and I will show you the whole cursed thing." The attic, which was the secretary's private place, and rather a small cell for so large a hermit, had indeed all the vestiges of a violent drama. Near the centre of the floor lay a large revolver as if flung away. Nearer to the left was rolled a whisky bottle, open but not quite empty. The cloth of the little table lay dragged and trampled, and the length of cord, like that found on the corpse, was cast wildly across the window-sill. Two vases were smashed on the mantelpiece, and one on the carpet. "I was drunk," said Royce, and this simplicity in the prematurely battered man somehow had the pathos of the first sin of a baby. "You all know about me," he continued huskily. "Everybody knows how my story began, and it may as well end like that too. I was called a clever man once. I might have been a happy one. Armstrong saved the remains of a brain and a body from the taverns and was always kind to me in his own way, poor fellow. Only he wouldn't let me marry Alice here, and it will always be said that he was right enough. Well, you can form your own conclusions, and you won't want me to go into details. That is my whisky bottle half emptied in the corner. That is my revolver quite emptied on the carpet. It was the rope from my box that was found on the corpse, and it was from my window the corpse was thrown. You need not set detectives to grub up my tragedy. It is a common enough weed in this world. I give myself to the gallows, and, by God, that is enough. At a sufficiently delicate sign, the police gathered round the large man to lead him away. But their unobtrusiveness was somewhat staggered by the remarkable appearance of Father Brown, who was on his hands and knees on the carpet in the doorway, as if engaged in some kind of undignified prayers. Being a person utterly insensible to the social figure he cut, he remained in this posture, but turned a bright round face up at the company, presenting the appearance of a quadruped with a very comic human head. "I say," he said good-naturedly, "this really won't do at all, you know. At the beginning you said we'd found no weapon, but now we're finding too many. There's a knife to stab, and the rope to strangle, and the pistol to shoot, and after all he broke his neck by falling out of a window. It won't do, it's not economical." And he shook his head at the ground as a horse does grazing. Inspector Gilder had opened his mouth with serious intentions, but before he could speak the grotesque figure on the floor had gone on quite volubly. And now 3 quite impossible things. First, these holes in the carpet where the 6 bullets have gone in. Why on earth should anybody fire at the carpet? A drunken man lets fly at his enemy's head, the thing that's grinning at him. He doesn't pick a quarrel with his feet or lay siege to his slippers. And then there's the rope, and having done with the carpet, the speaker lifted his hands and put them in his pocket, but continued unaffectedly on his knees. In what conceivable intoxication would anybody try to put a rope round a man's neck and finally put it round his leg? Royce, anyhow, was not so drunk as that, or he would be sleeping like a log by now. And plainest of all, the whisky bottle. You suggest a dipsomaniac fought for the whisky bottle, and then having won, rolled it away in a corner, spilling one half and leaving the other. That is the very last thing a dipsomaniac would do. He scrambled awkwardly to his feet and said to the self-accused murderer in tones of limpid penitence, "I'm awfully sorry, my dear sir, but your tale is really rubbish." "Sir," said Alice Armstrong in a low tone to the priest, "can I speak to you alone for a moment?" This request forced the communicative cleric out of the gangway, and before he could speak in the next room, the girl was talking with strange incisiveness. "You are a clever man," she said, "and you are trying to save Patrick, I know. But it's no use. The core of all this is black, and the more things you find out, the more there will be against the miserable man I love." "Why?" asked Brown, looking at her steadily. "Because," she answered equally steadily, "I saw him commit the crime myself." "Ah," said the unmoved Brown. "And what did he do?" "I was in the room next to them," she explained. "Both doors were closed, but I suddenly heard a voice, such as I had never heard on earth, roaring, 'Hell, hell, hell,' again and again. And then the 2 doors shook with the first explosions of the revolver. Thrice again the thing banged before I got the 2 doors open and found the room full of smoke. But the pistol was smoking in my poor, mad Patrick's hand, and I saw him fire the last murderous volley with my own eyes. Then he leapt on my father, who was clinging in terror to the window-sill, and grappling, tried to strangle him with the rope, which he threw over his head, but which slipped over his struggling shoulders to his feet. Then it tightened round one leg, and Patrick dragged him along like a maniac. I snatched a knife from the mat, and, rushing between them, managed to cut the rope before I fainted." "I see," said Father Brown with the same wooden civility. "Thank you." As the girl collapsed under her memories, the priest passed stiffly into the next room, where he found Gilder and Merton alone with Patrick Royce, who sat in a chair handcuffed. "There," he said to the inspector submissively. "Might I say a word to the prisoner in your presence, and might he take off those funny cuffs for a minute?" "He is a very powerful man," said Merton in an undertone. "Why do you want them taken off?" "Why, I thought," replied the priest humbly, "that perhaps I might have the very great honour of shaking hands with him." Both detectives stared, and Father Brown added, "Won't you tell them about it, sir?" The man in the chair shook his tousled head, and the priest turned impatiently. "Then I will," he said. "Private lives are more important than public reputations. I am going to save the living and let the dead bury their dead." He went to the fatal window and blinked out of it as he went on talking. "I told you that in this case there were too many weapons and only one death. I tell you now that they were not weapons and were not used to cause death. All those grisly tools, the noose, the bloody knife, the exploding pistol, were instruments of a curious mercy. They were not used to kill Sir Aaron, but to save him." "To save him?" repeated Gilder. "And from what?" "From himself," said Father Brown. "He was a suicidal maniac." "What?" cried Merton in an incredulous tone. "And the religion of cheerfulness?" "It is a cruel religion," said the priest, looking out of the window. "Why couldn't they let him weep a little, like his fathers before him?" His plans stiffened, his views grew cold. Behind that merry mask was the empty mind of the atheist. At last, to keep up his hilarious public level, he fell back on that dram drinking he had abandoned long ago. But there is this horror about alcoholism in a sincere teetotaler that he pictures and expects the psychological inferno from which he has warned others. It leapt upon poor Armstrong prematurely, and by this morning he was in such a case that he sat here and cried he was in hell, in so crazy a voice that his daughter did not know it. He was mad for death, and with the monkey tricks of the mad he had scattered round him death in many shapes, a running noose, and his friend's revolver and a knife. Royce entered accidentally and acted in a flash. He flung the knife on the mat behind him, snatched up the revolver, and having no time to unload it, emptied it shot after shot all over the floor. The suicide saw a fourth shape of death and made a dash for the window. The rescuer did the only thing he could, ran after him with the rope and tried to tie him hand and foot. Then it was that the unlucky girl ran in and, misunderstanding the struggle, strove to slash her father free. At first she only slashed poor Royce's knuckles, from which has come all the little blood in this affair. But of course you noticed that he left blood, but no wound, on that servant's face. Only before the poor woman swooned, she did hack her father loose, so that he went crashing through that window into eternity. There was a long stillness slowly broken by the metallic noises of Gilder unlocking the handcuffs of Patrick Royce, to whom he said, "I think I should have told the truth, sir. You and the young lady are worth more than Armstrong's obituary notices." "Confound Armstrong's notices," cried Royce roughly. "Don't you see it was because she mustn't know?" "Mustn't know what?" asked Merton. "Why, that she killed her father, you fool," roared the other. "He'd have been alive now but for her. It might craze her to know that." "No, I don't think it would," remarked Father Brown as he picked up his hat. "I rather think I should tell her. Even the most murderous blunders don't poison life like sins. Anyhow, I think you may both be the happier now. I got to go back to the deaf school." As he went out onto the gusty grass, an acquaintance from Highgate stopped him and said, "The coroner has arrived. The inquiry is just going to begin." "I've got to get back to the deaf school," said Father Brown. "I'm sorry I can't stop for the inquiry." End of The Three Tools of Death by G.K. Chesterton.
The Trailor Murder Mystery by Abraham Lincoln. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Devorah Allen. In the year 1841, there resided, at different points in the state of Illinois, 3 brothers by the name of Trailor. Their Christian names were William, Henry, and Archibald. Archibald resided at Springfield, then as now the seat of government of the state. He was a sober, retiring, and industrious man of about 30 years of age, a carpenter by trade and a bachelor, boarding with his partner in business, a Mr. Myers. Henry, a year or 2 older, was a man of like retiring and industrious habits, had a family, and resided with it on a farm at Clary's Grove, about 20 miles distant from Springfield in a northwesterly direction. William, still older, and with similar habits, resided on a farm in Warren County, distant from Springfield something more than 100 miles in the same northwesterly direction. He was a widower with several children. In the neighborhood of William's residence there was, and had been for several years, a man by the name of Fisher, who was somewhat above the age of 50, had no family and no settled home, but who boarded and lodged a while here and a while there, with persons for whom he did little jobs of work. His habits were remarkably economical, so that an impression got about that he had accumulated a considerable amount of money. In the latter part of May, in the year mentioned, William formed the purpose of visiting his brothers at Clary's Grove in Springfield, and Fisher, at the time having his temporary residence at his house, resolved to accompany him. They set out together in a buggy with a single horse. On Sunday evening they reached Henry's residence and stayed overnight. On Monday morning, being the first Monday of June, they started on to Springfield, Henry accompanying them on horseback. They reached town about noon, met Archibald, went with him to his boarding-house, and there took up their lodgings for the time they should remain. After dinner, the 3 Trailors and Fisher left the boarding-house in company, for the avowed purpose of spending the evening together and looking about the town. At supper, the Trailors had all returned, but Fisher was missing, and some inquiry was made about him. After supper, the Trailors went out professedly in search of him. One by one they returned, the last coming in after late tea-time, and each stating that he had been unable to discover anything of Fisher. The next day, both before and after breakfast, they went professedly in search again, and returned at noon, still unsuccessful. Dinner again being had, William and Henry expressed a determination to give up the search and start for their homes. This was remonstrated against by some of the boarders about the house, on the ground that Fisher was somewhere in the vicinity, and would be left without any conveyance as he and William had come in the same buggy. The remonstrance was disregarded, and they departed for their homes respectively. Up to this time, the knowledge of Fisher's mysterious disappearance had spread very little beyond the few boarders at Myers, and excited no considerable interest. After the lapse of 3 or 4 days, Henry returned to Springfield for the ostensible purpose of making further search for Fisher. Procuring some of the boarders, he, together with them and Archibald, spent another day in ineffectual search, when it was again abandoned, and he returned home. No general interest was yet excited. On the Friday, week after Fisher's disappearance, the postmaster at Springfield received a letter from the postmaster nearest William's residence, in Warren County, stating that William had returned home without Fisher, and was saying rather boastfully that Fisher was dead, and had willed him his money, and that he had got about $1,500 by it. The letter further stated that William's story and conduct seemed strange, and desired the postmaster at Springfield to ascertain and write what was the truth in the matter. The postmaster at Springfield made the letter public, and at once excitement became universal and intense. Springfield at that time had a population of about 3,500, with a city organization. The Attorney General of the state resided there. A purpose was forthwith formed to ferret out the mystery, in putting which into execution the mayor of the city and the Attorney General took the lead. To make search for, and if possible find the body of the man supposed to be murdered, was resolved on as the first step. In pursuance of this, men were formed into large parties and marched abreast in all directions, so as to let no inch of ground in the vicinity remain unsearched. Examinations were made of cellars, wells, and pits of all descriptions, where it was thought possible the body might be concealed. All the fresh or tolerably fresh graves in the graveyard were pried into, and dead horses and dead dogs were disinterred, where in some instances they had been buried by their partial masters. This search, as has appeared, commenced on Friday. It continued until Saturday afternoon without success, when it was determined to dispatch officers to arrest William and Henry at their residences, respectively. The officers started on Sunday morning. Meanwhile, the search for the body was continued, and rumors got afloat of the Trailors having passed at different times and places several gold pieces, which were readily supposed to have belonged to Fisher. On Monday, the officers sent for Henry, having arrested him, arrived with him. The mayor and attorney general took charge of him, and set their wits to work to elicit a discovery from him. He denied, and persisted in denying. They still plied him in every conceivable way, till Wednesday, when, protesting his own innocence, he stated that his brothers, William and Archibald, had murdered Fisher, that they had killed him, without his, Henry's, knowledge at the time, and made a temporary concealment of his body. That immediately preceding his and William's departure from Springfield for home, on Tuesday, the day after Fisher's disappearance, William and Archibald communicated the fact to him, and engaged his assistance in making a permanent concealment of the body. That at the time he and William left professedly for home, they did not take the road directly, but, meandering their way through the streets, entered the woods at the northwest of the city, 200 or 300 yards to the right of where the road they should have travelled entered them. That, penetrating the woods some few hundred yards, they halted, and Archibald came a somewhat different route on foot and joined them. That William and Archibald then stationed him, Henry, on an old and disused road that ran nearby as a sentinel, to give warning of the approach of any intruder. That William and Archibald then removed the buggy to the edge of a dense brush thicket about 40 yards distant from his, Henry's, position, where, leaving the buggy, they entered the thicket, and in a few minutes returned with the body and placed it in the buggy. That from his station he could, and did, distinctly see that the object placed in the buggy was a dead man, of the general appearance and size of Fisher. That William and Archibald then moved off with the buggy in the direction of Hickox's mill pond, and after an absence of half an hour returned, saying they had put him in a safe place. That Archibald then left for town, and he and William found their way to the road, and made for their homes. At this disclosure all lingering credulity was broken down, and excitement rose to an almost inconceivable height. Up to this time the well-known character of Archibald had repelled and put down all suspicions as to him. Till then, those who were ready to swear that a murder had been committed were almost as confident that Archibald had had no part in it. But now he was seized and thrown into jail, and indeed his personal security rendered it by no means objectionable to him. And now came the search for the brush thicket, and the search of the mill pond. The thicket was found, and the buggy tracks at the point indicated. At a point within the thicket, the signs of a struggle were discovered, and a trail from thence to the buggy track was traced. In attempting to follow the track of the buggy from the thicket, it was found to proceed in the direction of the mill pond, but could not be traced all the way. At the pond, however, it was found that a buggy had been backed down to and partially into the water's edge. Search was now to be made in the pond, and it was made in every imaginable way. Hundreds and hundreds were engaged in raking, fishing, and draining. After much fruitless effort in this way, on Thursday morning the mill dam was cut down, and the water of the pond partially drawn off, and the same processes of search again gone through with. About noon of this day, the officer sent for William returned, having him in custody, and a man calling himself Dr. Gilmore came in company with him. It seems that the officer arrested William at his own house, early in the day on Tuesday, and started to Springfield with him. That after dark a while they reached Lewiston, in Fulton County, where they stopped for the night. That late in the night this Dr. Gilmore arrived, stating that Fisher was alive at his house, and that he had followed on to give the information, so that William might be released without further trouble. That the officer, distrusting Dr. Gilmore, refused to release William, but brought him on to Springfield, and the doctor accompanied them. On reaching Springfield, the doctor reasserted that Fisher was alive and at his house. At this, the multitude for a time were utterly confounded. Gilmore's story was communicated to Henry Trailor, who, without faltering, reaffirmed his own story about Fisher's murder. Henry's adherence to his own story was communicated to the crowd, and at once the idea started, and became nearly, if not quite universal, that Gilmore was a confederate of the Trailors, and had invented the tale he was telling to secure their release and escape. Excitement was again at its zenith. About 3 o'clock the same evening, Myers, Archibald's partner, started with a 2-horse carriage for the purpose of ascertaining whether Fisher was alive, as stated by Gilmore, and if so, of bringing him back to Springfield with him. On Friday, a legal examination was gone into before 2 justices, on the charge of murder against William and Archibald. Henry was introduced as a witness by the prosecution, and on oath reaffirmed his statements as heretofore detailed, and at the end of which he bore a thorough and rigid cross-examination without faltering or exposure. The prosecution also proved by a respectable lady that on the Monday evening of Fisher's disappearance she saw Archibald, whom she well knew, and another man whom she did not then know, but whom she believed at the time of testifying to be William, then present, and still another, answering the description of Fisher, all enter the timber at the northwest of town, the point indicated by Henry, and after 1 or 2 hours, saw William and Archibald return without Fisher. Several other witnesses testified that on Tuesday, at the time William and Henry professedly gave up the search for Fisher's body and started for home, they did not take the road directly, but did go into the woods, as stated by Henry. By others also it was proved that since Fisher's disappearance, William and Archibald had passed rather an unusual number of gold pieces. The statements heretofore made about the thicket, the signs of a struggle, the buggy tracks, etc., were fully proven by numerous witnesses. At this the prosecution rested. Dr. Gilmore was then introduced by the defendants. He stated that he resided in Warren County, about 7 miles distant from William's residence. That on the morning of William's arrest he was out from home, and heard of the arrest and of its being on a charge of the murder of Fisher. That on returning to his own house he found Fisher there. That Fisher was in very feeble health, and could give no rational account as to where he had been during his absence. That he, Gilmore, then started in pursuit of the officer, as before stated, and that he should have taken Fisher with him, only that the state of his health did not permit. Gilmore also stated that he had known Fisher for several years, and that he had understood he was subject to temporary derangement of mind, owing to an injury about his head received in early life. There was about Dr. Gilmore so much of the air and manner of truth that his statement prevailed in the minds of the audience and of the court, and the Trailors were discharged, although they attempted no explanation of the circumstances proven by the other witnesses. On the next Monday, Myers arrived in Springfield, bringing with him the now famed Fisher in full life and proper person. Thus ended this strange affair, and while it is readily conceived that a writer of novels could bring a story to a more perfect climax, it may well be doubted whether a stranger affair ever really occurred. Much of the matter remains in mystery to this day. The going into the woods with Fisher, and returning without him by the Trailors. Their going into the woods at the same place the next day after they professed to have given up the search. The signs of a struggle in the thicket, the buggy tracks at the edge of it, and the location of the thicket, and the signs about it, corresponding precisely with Henry's story, are circumstances that have never been explained. William and Archibald have both died since, William in less than a year, and Archibald in about 2 years after the supposed murder. Henry is still living, but never speaks of the subject. It is not the object of the writer of this to enter into the many curious speculations that might be indulged upon the facts of this narrative, yet he can scarcely forbear a remark upon what would almost certainly have been the fate of William and Archibald had Fisher not been found alive. It seems he had wandered away in mental derangement, and had he died in this condition, and his body been found in the vicinity, it is difficult to conceive what could have saved the Trailors from the consequence of having murdered him. Or, if he had died, and his body never found, the case against them would have been quite as bad, for although it is a principle of law that a conviction for murder shall not be had unless the body of the deceased be discovered, it is to be remembered that Henry testified that he saw Fisher's dead body. End of the Trailor Murder Mystery by Abraham Lincoln.
Walking the Rainbow by Grace King. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Matt Perard. Walking the Rainbow by Grace King. In spite of the careful attention of friends and the assiduities of talebearers, we live in a woeful state of ignorance as to the true condition of the sentiments of anyone about us, and when we interrogate our own judgment, We get no better enlightenment, for unfortunately we are all addicted to the pleasant habit of counting as friends those whom we like, as enemies those whom we dislike. For that reason alone, and only that reason, Mr. Talbot's memory did not carry Monsieur Pinseau as a friend. The ridiculous attempts at speech-making and the undignified campaign activities in favor of a political trickster that rankled so painfully in the Creole gentleman's remembrances of the past did not trouble the American at all. But the things that Monsieur Pinseau passed over with indulgence, those were the ones that Mr. Talbot's memory recorded with unalterable condemnation. In his own defeat and the triumph of the rival candidate he attributed nothing whatever to Monsieur Pinseau, whom he frankly did not credit with an idea in his head above fast living and extravagant spending of his wife's money, of, in short, playing the fool, as he called it, and of making associates of men who were also given to that pastime. Which shows, among other verities, how much more importance than they deserve we attach to our pitiful efforts to overthrow a good character and reputation. When Mr. Talbot heard his wife's report about Mademoiselle Mimi, he was vastly pleased. "All the money in the world," he said enthusiastically, "could not procure better instruction or instruction that agreed better with his ideas." It was what he had hoped, when he had money with which to realize his hopes. "A lady," he explained, "must furnish example as well as precept to her pupils." His objection to most governesses and teachers was that they were such a warning against themselves, generally an ugly, forlorn, disappointed and soured set of women, with far more of the furies than the graces about them. A teacher should represent to a little girl what she would like to be, for little girls learn by imitation mostly. Mrs. Talbot never contested the opinions of her husband. Her way of entertaining him was to let him talk to her, and to agree with him. As for the reasons of things, she seldom thought of them. The things themselves, she was wont to say, were as much as she could tackle. "Give the little girls a good model," he continued, "and the battle is half won." He would never allow a daughter of his to, emphasizing his meaning, be taught by a man, for she would end by trying to imitate him, and the result would be a hobbledehoy. Mademoiselle could teach all that it was essential for a lady to know, that is, how to take her place in society and maintain it. He smoked his pipe for a few minutes in silence, and his wife knew as well as if he had told her that he was thinking of those old salons on Royal, St. Louis and Chartres streets, where as a young man fresh from the University of Virginia he had met the charming society of the ladies whom he had never ceased to admire and whom he had chosen as the models for his daughters. The only drawback he could see in Mademoiselle Mimi's school was Monsieur Pinseau, and he charged his wife not to encourage any intimacy between the two families. He himself had never wished to know the man, had always avoided him, and he would not suffer his children to be thrown familiarly into company that he disapproved of. If the world were to be made of such as Monsieur Pinseau was reputed to be, there would be no morality and no law in it. He knew personally nothing against him, except that he went with a set of men that flaunted their follies and so demoralized society. It was always easier to prevent than to break off. He thought that Mademoiselle Mimi had better be told this at the outset, firmly and frankly. Then there could be no misunderstanding in the future. He confided to his wife this flaming sword and even instructed her as to how her delicate hands were to wield it. "Do not let your politeness get the better of you. Be firm and decided. There is nothing that a mother should be so decided about as the surroundings of her daughters. Mademoiselle Mimi is a sensible woman, and she will understand the importance of maintaining the standards of good society. A man cannot make his assertions in such matters as a woman can. A man represents at best only intellectual force, women spiritual. After a pause he continued. If women chose, they could rule the world through society. We can better get along with a corrupt judiciary than a corrupt society. Do not hurt her feelings, but make your point clear. You can be clear enough when you want. And you had better warn the children a little. Let them understand. Yes. I will depend upon you to manage it. Yes. Do it in your own time and your own way. Ladies have a gift for such things. A smile, a word, no more. But what a rebuke! A volume couldn't tell more, a pistol shot be more killing. He sank deep in his reflections, perhaps over some such pistol shot in his own memory. When there was no alternative between doing his will and being disagreeable, his wife was forced to exercise some of the gifts which she also possessed, in common with the charming ladies of his memory. For as much as he knew about them, she knew more. He saw the outside of their gifts, she the inside machinery. Tell a daughter, she said to herself, that her father is an improper acquaintance for little girls who know nothing against him, and never will know anything against him. Make Mademoiselle Mimi understand that there must be no intercourse between the two families, because, in short, my husband is better than her father. Where? Great heavens! Where? In what salons, ancient or modern, did ladies say such things one to another? Perhaps in the wilds of Virginia, where my husband was born, but not here, in Louisiana, where, thank heaven, I was born. If it were the truth, which it is, Mademoiselle Mimi would surely know it better than any one else. How could she help knowing it? What did her whole life mean otherwise? Her misfortunes, her labor, her unselfish devotion. What did it all mean to her, if not just that? But tell her so. Make her understand it, which means to make her acknowledge and confess it. Mademoiselle Mimi would very soon put an end to any such conversation as that. And to save society! Heavens above! Go around denouncing one another's fathers, brothers, husbands! That would be a feasible way of saving it, eh? What society would be left? And what woman would be sure enough of her own father, husband, brother, aye, sister, and even mother? There had been this consideration in some families that she knew of. Go around denouncing this one and that. No, no! Women maintain society by just the opposite plan. Men denounce the criminal, but hold on to the crime. Women denounce the crime, but hold on to the criminal. That is the difference between them. And Mademoiselle Mimi was right, 1,000 times right, as a woman. Husbands, despite their convictions and their superior assumptions to the contrary, have really no advantage over other men in knowledge of a woman's mind, or, in short, of the inner determinations of a wife's mind. They can only know in truth what the wife chooses to tell them, and a discreet wife often chooses to limit her communications of this kind. Wives, for example, such as Mr. Talbot admired in the old salons, who were as unlike missionaries as one can possibly conceive. They were not women to brandish moral swords. They were women, on the contrary, like Mademoiselle Mimi. So Mrs. Talbot was quite clear, in this at least, that Mademoiselle would be talked to as her husband directed at the Greek kalends, and not before. The bright glow of sunset shone in the sky. It brightened the spire of the little church, and seemed almost to give a golden tone to the thin, weak voice of the Angelus bell. A few oranges still glittered amid the dark foliage of the hedge. the sour, bitter kind, not the sweet ones whose flowers so poetically used to symbolize the hopes of brides. And the old garden, as an old face does sometimes from inward illumination, flushed under the golden and rose light of the sky into a flicker of its pristine witchery and beauty. The children were scattered through it, fondling and caressing it, as if, indeed, it were an old face. I have never worked for anything in my life that I did not get it in the end. The husband spoke meditatively from another milestone in his thoughts. This was true, but his wife had never heard him say so before. There never had been any need to say it before. It was taken for granted. Now? "But you worked hard for what you wanted," she responded quickly with her sure instinct of affection. "It was always said about you that you were the hardest working young lawyer at the bar. I always remember a story papa told about you. He was passing your office once in the middle of winter, long past midnight, and seeing a light in your office. All the other windows were black. He went upstairs to see if anything were the matter, opened the door, and there you were over your books, dressed just as you had come from some dinner party or ball." "Well, Talbot," he said disgustedly. Her husband took up the story with a laugh. "You must love work." "Love," I answered. "I love it better than meat and bread." His face showed his satisfaction at the memory of it. She possessed the art of recalling such things and repeating them appropriately. Her memory was a treasury to her. She never forgot a face, a name, a good deed, a pleasant speech, or a humorous incident. "Yes," her husband repeated, with gusto, "I always loved to work. I cared in fact for nothing in life that I did not work for. What a man makes up his mind to work for, he can obtain," he added confidently. And then he began to explain his plans again to her. Any one could understand them, they were so simple and natural. It was true he had lost a fortune, everything he had worked for and gained since he had been a lawyer. And he did not count in this what he should have inherited from his father, who had died during the war and whose estate had been settled in Confederate money. He counted as his own only what he had made, and no man had made more or larger fees than his. He called over, as lawyers never tire of doing, his cases in the past and the briefs, the historic briefs, he called them, that he had written. Having saved his library, he said, was the greatest piece of good fortune that could happen to him or any lawyer. If that had been lost, he would have considered himself unfortunate. The loss of his plantation would have been nothing in comparison to it. With its accumulation of private notes and records, it was perhaps the most complete in the city. He knew he would not have exchanged it for any he had ever seen. And he was lucky too in having his same old office. He could take up just where he had left off 4 years ago, and as far as he could see, it was only a question of work, with him, to catch up on the losses of the war. Fortunately, litigation could not be captured, confiscated, or burned. "The fact is," he concluded, with a frank laugh, "if there is any important lawsuit, there are 4 or 5 of us who are bound to be retained on one side or the other." The only change he would make from former plans was that, instead of sending his sons to the University of Virginia as he had intended, he would put them to work just as soon as they knew enough of the requisites, that is, Latin, Greek, and mathematics, with sufficient science for respectability, which was far more than the greatest Americans had started with 50 years ago. If there was anything in the boys, they could get along on the education he was able to give them. If they could not get along on that, it was a pretty good sign they would not get along on a better. The daughters would suffer less in education, for they could learn easier all that ladies needed to know, and take more time over it. He had always counted on giving each one of her dower when she became of age, so that she could marry or not just as she chose. He had seen some unfortunate young girls marry for money, some literally for the means of living. A dower, he feared, would be beyond his reach now. The consequences of the war would fall heavier on the women than on the men. The lives of the men would be changed comparatively little. But the women! It was slavery alone that had kept them from domestic drudgery. He shook his head and repeated, "Domestic drudgery added to family duties." He smoked his pipe a moment, and continued with a new variation of his subject, his wife listening without assent or dissent, looking through his telescope whichever way he wanted, either end the right one for her. He ran over the list of his friends who like him had broken away from all that had constituted life to them to go into the war. As he gave the name, his wife's ready memory supplied her usual pleasant addenda of reminiscences. How they used to like this one and that one, and how this one and that one used to like him and praise him to her, and all sorts of other items in connection with his friends that he had forgotten. Tossing over her little memories and rummaging in them as she once would have done in her great bureau drawer of scraps. And like the lady's scraps of that time, her bits from memory were all of beautiful quality: silk, velvet, brocade, real embroidery, real lace, buttons and buckles that looked like jewelry, ribbons, ostrich and marabou feathers, all too pretty to throw away, but so useless to keep except as souvenirs. The duel that he had prevented, the ugly family quarrel he had stopped, a reconciliation between a husband and wife bent on divorce, the last will and testament he had turned from resentment into forgiveness of injuries, and how he had always stood by the unfortunate. There was not a friend or client he could name that she could not connect with some personal obligation. It was only the good lawyer's usual showing at that time, and the wife's usual version of his services, services that only lawyers and their wives enhance with any glamour of sentimental obligation, for a lawyer's clients have no such glamour in their view of the transaction. But it was a pleasant review and a drawer of scraps that any lawyer's wife would be glad to own. Even old Benton, millionaire and miser that he was, had owned to her that the beginning of his great fortune was laid when Talbot was a young law student, and he, Benton, a porter carrying bundles of goods on his back up and down 4 and 5 flights of stairs. And there was Tommy Cook, whom he had picked up out of the gutter, for he could never see a bright boy run to waste without stretching out his hand to prevent it. And friends, friends, friends. Wherever they looked in the past they saw friends and not an enemy. For, according to the pleasant weakness already mentioned, they saw in the past none to whom they were not friendly, forgetting, of course, contradictory experiences. "I shall let Tommy Cook keep his desk in the office." "What does he want with the desk there?" the wife asked innocently. "Well, not to black shoes on, you may be sure. Tommy is a lawyer now." "How can he be a lawyer?" "By study and work, like other men." "But I always thought that lawyers had to be gentlemen." "I have never known a lawyer who was not a gentleman." "You have been very lucky, then," he answered dryly. There was silence between them for a moment, and then he took up the fallen thread of conversation again. "He has a pretty good practice already. He gained a suit for Benton the other day." "What? Did Benton employ him?" "He needed a lawyer, and Tommy is about as decent a one as he could find. He has been associated, at least, with the bar." "Yes, as a bootblack. Some of the others wouldn't have made even decent bootblacks. Butlers and camp followers mostly." She looked disgusted, but said nothing. "What?" she asked. brightening with a sudden inspiration, "what has become of the Riparian case?" Always before, that is before the war that had separated them from their past, in their talks about the future they would discuss this case. She had completely forgotten it. What a prominent object it had always been in her husband's horizon. For years his ambition had rested on it. It was to be, in his eyes, the masterpiece of his profession, to give him fame throughout the legal world. He used to say that if he never gained anything else but that one case he would have secured wealth for himself and his children, so far reaching would be the effects of a favorable decision. The fee was contingent, but he was as sure of getting it, he used to say, as he was sure the heavens would not fall. From the time that he had been called to the bar he had aimed at that case. He had studied and worked his way into it with such consummate patience and legal keenness that he was considered the only man in the city who had a perfect record of it in his mind. It was as much his own as any piece of property he could have bought. No matter when it was opened, now or 20 years hence, it could not be opened without his appearing in it as principal counsel. How strange, thought the wife, that everything else should give way in the South, government, states' rights, social order, and that a great war should be fought and thousands of lives lost, and a mere question of the city's riparian rights should survive. That like a lighthouse it should still be standing after the storm that has strewn the shore with wrecks. This led her to ask about their friend Dalton, who, having studied law in her husband's office, had been employed in some minor capacity in this very riparian case. Dalton? Oh, Dalton went into the war a private, and has come out a major. Well, is he any more human? Any less like a fish, cold and slippery? As she had done about the riparian case, her husband might well have wondered how such an idle and futile prejudice could survive the fierce tempest that had almost engulfed the national government, and wrecked its apparently indestructible fortunes. He answered quietly: "He is very much improved in appearance and seems full of energy. He will stay in my office and use my library until he is able to set up an independent establishment." A click of the gate's latchet caused them to raise their heads and look in that direction, and as they saw who was coming down the walk toward them, both exclaimed, "Harry Linton!" Both stepped forward to meet him, the aunt repeating with a glad smile, "Harry! Harry! I was thinking about him only today." She had not seen him since he waved his cap in good bye to her from the car window when his company left for Virginia. The gay young nephew who had lived with them while he studied law with his uncle, whom he loved, it may be said, for his faults, for he had made no display of the family virtues. He was still boyish looking, and had still the same old irresistible expression of friendliness and good humor on his round, freckled face, and in his blue eyes, and his light hair stood out as it used to in thick curls over his head. The only change was a long, ugly scar that extended over one side of his face, from forehead to chin, cutting across an eye. He looked taller, and showed the effect of drilling in his bearing, but he was still shorter than his uncle by a full head. They drew their chairs together, the children clustering on the steps in good hearing. "Well," said his uncle, "what are you doing?" "No, no," protested the aunt. "He must begin from the time he left us and tell us all his adventures. I want to hear the whole story from beginning to end." The young fellow laughed and told hurriedly how, after he was wounded in Virginia, he had been sent back to Louisiana to recuperate, and then had been transferred to the Louisiana command where, in a desperate fight on Red River, a small company tried to delay the advance of the Federal army, which they succeeded in doing; how he received his wound in the face, and was insensible when he was taken prisoner and brought to New Orleans. After he was discharged from the hospital, he was kept in prison until peace was declared, The children crowded upon one another to get nearer to him while he talked along in his gay, bright, reckless way. "As soon as I could get out of the city," he continued, "I started for home. I hadn't heard a word from my people for a year, and didn't know anything about them, except that they had taken refuge in Texas. You know, our place was just on the line of Banks' March." His uncle nodded. "And then? And then?" His aunt's voice quivered with impatience. "The chimneys are still standing, and that is all that was left to show that there had been a human habitation there." "Oh, oh!" wailed the aunt. "That beautiful old house, that fine plantation." Harry was too much amused at the story to come to waste time on the lament. He threw his head back and laughed as at a joke. "Ha, ha! I wish you could have seen the family come back. I was lucky enough to get there the day before. I camped during the night in the shelter of my ancestral ruins, that is, in the furnace of the sugar house. There were not enough ruins of anything else to shelter a cat," laughing. "I knew they would come straight to the place as quick as they could travel, and I had a presentiment that that would be about as quick as I could get there from the city. Well, I was standing in front of my furnace, looking about for something to look at, when here they came, just about dusk. First a broken down buggy tied with a rope, drawn by a limping horse. Elizabeth was in it with Heatherstone. Behind them came a little cart with a kind of cover over it, drawn by an old gray mule. Mother drove that, and it seemed filled with children. Their heads stuck out in all directions, like chickens in a basket." All laughed with him at this picture. "Heatherstone was shot all to pieces at Mansfield, you know. I had heard that he was wounded, but I really did not know until I saw him that he had lost both an arm and a leg." "An arm and a leg! Oh, Harry!" cried his aunt in horror. "Yes, and on the hand he has left he has only 3 fingers. The thumb and forefinger had to be amputated." "Oh, how does he stand it?" asked the uncle, curtly interrupting the soft, sympathetic voice. "He was the last man in the country to play the invalid with success." "Invalid? He an invalid? Whew!" Harry threw back his head and whistled. "I was fool enough to think I might say something to him, to show a little feeling, to express some sort of sympathy and that sort of thing about his being a cripple. By Jove!" The young man jumped up to act the scene for them. He turned upon me as if I were a Yankee. "Damn it, sir, do you dare sympathize with me, sir? Damn your sympathy! I don't want any man's damned sympathy. Take your damned sympathy where it is needed, sir. We don't need it here, sir." He was a capital mimic, and did the scene so well that one saw the tall gaunt figure of his Texan brother-in-law, as well as heard him snarling out his short sentences. "I will let you know, sir, I am as good a man now, sir, as I ever was. I can do without my leg, sir, and my arm, sir. The Yankees are welcome to them, sir, damn them. My wife, sir, doesn't need them either. My wife, sir, at this moment is worth more than any 100 damn Yankees I ever came across, sir. They didn't shoot off her leg, sir, or her arm, and you needn't go offering her any of your damn sympathy either, sir. She doesn't need it." And I took his advice. I didn't sympathize any more with any of them. You would never recognize Elizabeth. She goes stalking about in a pair of her husband's old cavalry boots and an old hat of his, and she ties her skirts up to her knees like the Negro women used to do in the fields, and she wears a pistol stuck in her belt. In fact, she does everything she can to make a man out of herself, except curse and smoke. And the more of a man she is, the better her husband likes it. The two are always together. Mother takes care of the children. How is your mother?" Harry sat down and laughed at this memory also. "Mother is not changed a particle, not a shade. She goes stepping around in her old faded calico dress and sunbonnet, just exactly as she used to at Princeton in that ugly old India shawl of hers and bird of paradise bonnet. She is just as unbending, just as firm, just as sure of herself, and she keeps Heatherstone, that's the eldest boy, under her thumb just as she used to do me. Makes him study of nights, and tells him what great things she expects of him, exactly as she used to do with me. Not one of them will own to being hurt by the results of the war. They pooh their losses. In fact, they live as if the Yankees were watching and listening to them all the time, and they will die before they gratify them with a regret. I found out, seeing that his audience was waiting in silence for more on the subject, that mother and sister had about $50 in gold. $50 in gold! His aunt exclaimed in amazement, as if it were a fortune. Yes, $50 in gold. How did they manage to save so much? They didn't save it, pausing to enhance his effect. They made it. Made it! Ejaculated the aunt in still greater amazement. How could they make money? How could they make it? For the first time his voice was grave. Why, they were in some God-forsaken place in Texas where the children were hungry for food and cold for clothes, and they had to make money or beg. But what could they do? They knit, they spun, they cooked, lowering his voice and speaking slower. They took in washing and ironing, and they planted a little cotton, only a few rows, for the knitting, you know, and at the end of the war they had a little pile of it stuffed into their mattresses. Of course it was good as gold, and when Heatherstone returned to them he came in a buggy with an old broken-down army horse that the commissary department allowed him, as it was the only way he could travel. The cart and the mule he managed to pick up somewhere. I believe he gave one of his pistols for them. How many children had they? Asked his aunt. 5. They lost 2. Heatherstone, the eldest, is a fine boy. You did not make up your mind to stay with them? Asked his uncle. The fact is, uncle, when I went there it was to stay with them and work on the old plantation, and when I saw Heatherstone I was determined to do so, for I never felt so sorry for people in my life, looking at his uncle and then at his aunt, as when I saw them unloading themselves from their buggy and cart. I could have stayed willingly with them and worked like a Negro for them the rest of my days, but they wouldn't hear of such a thing, grew indignant at the very idea of it. Heatherstone seemed to take it as a reflection on himself and sister, and mother waxed eloquent over my duty to become a great lawyer and chief justice of the state, just as she used to do when we all had fortunes. They camped out that night, as they had done nearly every night of their journey from Texas, but by noon the next day they were having a shelter put up around one of the old chimneys. Heatherstone and Elizabeth had gone out about daylight and rooted up some of the old Negroes somewhere, and found the lumber. They said they could put up a very comfortable cabin for the $50, and began at once to talk about a garden, chickens, and 10 acres of cotton. I suppose Heatherstone, the boy, will do the plowing when they get a plow, and I have not the slightest doubt but that mother and Elizabeth will help in the hoeing, and of course all, down to the youngest, will take a hand in the picking. In spite of his natural high spirits and his fondness for laughing at his people, his voice grew sad. As they didn't seem to have thought of me in any of their plans, and in fact, so far as I could see, didn't need me or want me, I concluded that the thing for me to do was to come back to the city and see if I could not make a little money here. They will need ready money, and that badly, long before spring, if I am not much mistaken. Well, said his uncle reflectively, I do not know but what you are right. You selected the bar for your profession, studied for it, and were admitted. I do not see any good reason why you should throw away all the time, work, and expense you gave to it. Your 4 years of soldiering ought not to make you a worse lawyer. On the contrary, it ought to make you a better one. He smoked a few ships from his pipe, and concluded with, and I have always thought, Harry, You ought to make a pretty good lawyer of yourself." "I believe myself," said the young fellow, rising, "that I could at least make a living for my mother and myself at it, if I had a fair chance. There is no telling, however, what the outcome of all this is going to be," he added, with rather a questioning look at his uncle. "Oh," was the answer, "I fancy the country will soon settle down and go to work to repair the losses. That is what I'm going to do," with a frank laugh. "I had thought," the young fellow hesitated, glancing furtively at his aunt as he used to do in critical ventures with his uncle, "I had thought of trying something else, to make money a little quicker. Times are changed." "But we are not." "I don't know about that, uncle." "But I do know. I might get a clerkship somewhere." "A clerkship!" "Well, it would give me some money at once." The mother hastily gathered her children together. "It is their bedtime," she explained with a cheerful voice, but trying to make her nephew see her warning shake of the head. "He is no wiser about getting along with his uncle than he was before he went to the war," she said to herself as she left the gallery. But looking back from the room, she saw the two men walking together down the path to the gate, the elder one turning his head toward the younger one, and she knew, as well as if she heard the words, that some of the funds brought by the Herald of Prosperity was to be dispatched at once to the cabin built around the chimney of the ruined plantation. End of Walking the Rainbow by Grace King, from The Pleasant Ways of St. Medard.
White Roses by L.P.Jacks. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dan Gurzinski. White Roses by L.P.Jacks. Of all the conversations of the learned, those in which history and philosophy maintain the dialogue are probably the most instructive. Such a conversation I was fortunate enough to hear not long ago at the dinner table of a friend, and the occasion was more interesting inasmuch as the philosopher of the party was led by a turn of the argument to lay aside his mantle and assume the role of the storyteller, thereby providing us with a valuable comment on the very philosophy with which his own illustrious name has been long associated. We had been talking during dinner about a certain expedition to the South Seas undertaken by the British government in the 18th century, and the historian had just finished a most surprising narration of the facts, based on his recent investigation of unpublished documents, when our hostess glanced at the clock and, rising from her chair, gave the signal to the ladies to depart. When we had resumed our places, the professor of philosophy said to the historian, "I wish you would tell us what in your opinion it was that caused the expedition to turn out such an utter failure." "The expedition failed," said the historian, "because the commander was not allowed to select his own crews. The government of the day was corrupt, and insisted on manning the ships with men of its own choosing. Some were diseased, others were criminals, many had never handled a rope in their lives. Before the fleet had doubled Cape Horn, 1/3 of the crews had perished, and the rest were mutinous. The enterprise was doomed to failure from the start." "The whole planet is manned in the same manner," said the pessimist, as he helped himself to one of our host's superlative cigars. "I'm sorry for the commander, whoever he is." "What precisely do you mean?" said the professor of philosophy, holding a lighted match to the end of the pessimist's cigar. "I mean," said the pessimist, "that the prospects of the human expedition can't be very bright so long as society has to put up with anybody and everybody who happens to be born. I suppose there is a human expedition," he went on. "At least you have written as though there were. But who selects the crew? Nobody. They come aboard as they happen to be born, and the unfortunate commander has to put up with them as they come. Broken men, jail deliveries, invalids, seasick landlubbers, and heaven knows what. Who in his senses would put to sea with such a crowd? Humanity is always in a state like that of your expedition when it doubled Cape Horn. Incompetent, mutinous, or sick unto death. And what else can you expect in view of the conditions under which we all arrive on the planet? The host now glanced uneasily at the professor of philosophy, whose treatise on the world purpose was famous throughout 3 continents. The professor was visibly arming himself for the fray. He had just filled his claret glass with port. "Remember," said the host, "that we must join the ladies in 20 minutes at the utmost." "I'm not going to argue," replied the philosopher after a resolute sip at his port. "I'm going to tell you a story." "Tell it in the drawing-room," said the son of the house, who had taken his pretty cousin down to dinner, and was a little exhilarated by that, and by the excellence of his father's wine. That is to say, and he spoke eagerly as if a bright idea had struck him, that is to say, of course, if it will bear telling in the presence of ladies. There was a roar of laughter, and the son of the house blushed to the roots of his hair. "I am inclined to think," said the professor, "that my story, so far from being unsuitable for the ladies, will be intelligible to no one else." "We'll join the ladies at once," said the host, "and hear the professor's story." The pessimist, who was fond of talking, now broke in. "That," he said, "is most attractive, but not quite fair to me. I should like to finish what I have begun, and I doubt if my views will be quite in place in the drawing-room. Besides, the professor must finish his port. I was only going to say," he went on, "that the having to put up with all that comes in human shape is a very serious affair. It seems to me that we all arrive in the world like dumped goods. Nobody has ordered us, and nobody wants us. Our parents wanted us, did you say? Well, I suppose our parents wanted children. But it doesn't follow that they wanted you or me. Somebody else might have filled the book as well or better. Our birth is a matter of absolute chance. For example, my father has often told me how he met my mother. There was a picnic on a Swiss lake. My father's watch was slow, and when he arrived at the quay, the boat that carried his party was out of sight. It so happened that there was another party, people my father didn't know, going to another island, and seeing him disconsolate on the quay, they took pity on him and made him go with them. It was in that boat that he first met my mother. The moral is obvious. If my father's watch had kept better time, I should never have been in existence. A jolly good thing, too, whispered the son of the house. Neither would my 6 brothers, nor any of our descendants to the nth generation. Well, that's how the whole planet gets itself manned. That's how the crew is chosen. And that's why the expedition gets into trouble on rounding Cape Horn. "It's a capital introduction to my story," said the professor, in whom, after his second claret glass of port, the world purpose had assumed a new intensity. "I wish the ladies could have heard it." "I venture to think," said our host, "that the ladies will understand the story all the better for not having heard the introduction. You see, I am assuming that the story is a good one, which is as much as to say that no introduction is needed." "Thank you," said the professor. "I say," broke in the son of the house, "I say, Professor, it's a pity you didn't take that question up in The World Purpose. That's an awfully good point of the pessimist's, and a jolly difficult one to answer, too. I should like to see you tackle it. Why, I once heard the pater here say to the mater—" "We'll go upstairs," said our host. "About 10 years ago," the professor began, "I was traveling one night in a third-class carriage to a town on the northeast coast. My 2 companions in the compartment were evidently mother and daughter. The mother had a singularly beautiful and intelligent face, and the daughter, who was about 12 years old, resembled her. They were dressed in good taste, without rings or finery, and, so far as I am able to judge such things, without expense. Prior to the departure of the train from the London terminus, I had noticed the two walking up and down the platform and looking into the carriages, apparently endeavoring to find a compartment to themselves. They didn't succeed, and finally entered the compartment where I was. Whether I ought to have been flattered by this or the reverse, I knew not. I could see they wanted to be alone, and I felt a brief impulse to leave them to themselves and go elsewhere. It would have been a chivalrous act, but whether from indolence or curiosity or some other feeling, I let the impulse die and remained where I was. The girl began immediately to arrange cushions for her mother in the corner of the carriage, and from the solicitude she showed, I gathered that the mother, though to all appearance in health, was either ill or convalescent. By the time I had come to this conclusion, the train was already in motion, or I verily believe I should have obeyed my first impulse and left the carriage. I am glad, however, that I did not. When all had been arranged, I noticed that the two had settled themselves in the attitude of lovers, their hands clasped, the girl's resting her head on her mother's shoulder and gazing into her face from time to time with a look of infinite tenderness. It was some relief to me to observe that, lover-like, they seemed indifferent to my presence. I was reading a book, though I confess that my eyes and mind would constantly wander to the other side of the carriage. I am not a sentimental person, and scenes of sentiment are particularly objectionable to my temper of mind. But for once in my life I was overawed by the consciousness that I was in the presence of deep and genuine emotion. Finally I gave up the effort to read. A strange mental atmosphere seemed to surround me. I fell into a reverie, and I remember waking suddenly from a kind of dream or incoherent meditation on the pathos and tragedy of human life. I looked at my companions, and I saw that both were weeping. The girl was in the same position as before. The mother had turned her face away, and was looking out into the blackness of the night. Tear after tear rolled down her cheek. They must have become conscious that I was observing them, though God knows I had little will to do so. I took up my book and pretended to read, and I knew that an effort was being made, that tears were being checked, that some climbing sorrow was being held down. Presently the lady said, speaking in a steady voice, "Do you know the name of the station we have just passed?" I told her the name of the station, asked if I should raise the window, spoke to the girl, offered an illustrated paper, and so on through the usual preliminaries of a traveller's talk. The answers I received were such as one expects from people of charming manners, but nothing followed for a time, and I again took up my book. The book I was reading, or pretending to read, was a volume of the Ingersoll lectures, bearing on the back the title, Human Immortality. Once or twice I noticed the eyes of the woman resting on this, and I was greatly surprised when, in one of the pauses when I laid down the book, she said, "Would you mind my asking you a question?" "Certainly not." "Do you believe in the immortality of the soul?" As a teacher of philosophy, I am accustomed to leading questions at all sorts of inopportune moments, but never in my life was I so completely taken aback. However, I collected my thoughts as best I could, and though the subject is one on which I never like to speak without prolonged preparation, I briefly told her my opinions on that great problem, as you may find them expressed in my published works. Possibly I spoke with some fervor, the more likely because I spoke without preparation. She listened with great attention, and as for the young girl, her face was lit up with a look of intelligent eagerness, which, had I seen it for one moment in my own classroom, would have rewarded me for the labor of a long course of lectures. I had still much to say when the train drew up at the platform of St. Bede's. "I'm sorry not to hear more," said the lady, "but this is our destination." "And there is Dad!" cried the girl. A man in working clothes stood at the carriage door. "Good-bye," said the woman, warmly shaking me by the hand. "You've been most kind to me." "Good-bye," said the daughter. "You're a dear old dear." And with that she threw her arms around my neck and kissed me fervently 3 or 4 times. I was greatly surprised, but not altogether displeased. They were evidently a most affectionate family. As the train moved off, the three stood arm in arm before the carriage door. "Got 2 sweethearts tonight, sir," said the man. "And without jealousy," said I congratulate you on each of them." "I hope you'll forgive my daughter," he said. "She's an impulsive little baggage." "She may repeat the offense the next time we meet," I replied, and we all laughed. It was a joyful ending to what had been, in some respects, a painful experience. "I don't see the point of your story, Professor, and I am at a loss to imagine what it has to do with my introduction." This from the pessimist. "The story has only begun," said the Professor, who was sipping his tea. "Those kisses at the end were jolly hard lines on a man who dislikes sentiment," said the son of the house. "I didn't find them so," answered the Professor, "but remember, they were only the kisses of a child." "The best sort," growled the pessimist. "True," said our hostess. "The judgments of children are the judgments of God. But let the Professor go on." It was 7 or 8 months later, the Professor resumed, when on opening the Times one morning, my attention was caught by an item of news relating to the town at which my 2 companions had alighted from the train. The news itself was of no importance, but the name of the town printed at the head of the paragraph strangely arrested me, and served to recall with singular vividness the incident of my former journey. I found myself repeating, in order and minute detail, everything that had happened in the carriage, some of the particulars of which I had forgotten till that moment. The end of it was that I became possessed with a strong desire to visit St. Bede's, though I had no connections whatever with the place, and had never stayed there in my life. I knew, of course, that it was an interesting old town with a famous cathedral, and I remember persuading myself at the time, and indeed telling my wife, that I ought to visit that cathedral without further delay. As the day wore on, the impulse grew stronger, and eventually overpowered me. I travelled down to St. Bede's that night, and put up at one of the principal hotels. The next morning was spent in the usual manner of sightseers in an ancient town. Reserving the cathedral for the afternoon, I visited the old wall and the dismantled quays, and wandered among the narrow streets, reading history, as my habit is, from the monuments with which the place abounded. About noon I found my way to the spacious market-place, and began inspecting the beautiful front of the old town hall. I suddenly became aware of a man on the opposite pavement who was watching me with some interest. What drew my attention to him was a large mass of white roses, which he was carrying in a basket. For, as you know, I have been for many years an enthusiastic rose-grower, and there is nothing which attracts the mind so rapidly as any circumstance connected with one's hobby. The man was dressed in good clothes, and it was this that prevented me at first from recognizing him as the person who had met my 2 companions at the station 7 months before. Seeing that I observed him, he crossed the street. "You remembered me," he said. "Well, I have been looking for you all over the town. Had I known your name, I should have asked at the hotels." "But how did you know I had arrived?" I asked. "My wife told me you were here." "She must have seen me then," I said. "Yes, she saw you. She saw you arrive last night at the station, and she saw you later standing under an electric lamp in front of the cathedral." This struck me as odd, for I had purposely waited till near midnight before going to the cathedral, that I might see the exterior in the light of the moon, and I had been confident that not a soul was about. "How is she?" I asked, for I remembered my previous impression that she was an invalid. "Oh, much better," he answered. "In fact, quite restored. It's a great comfort." "It was very kind of her to send you to look for me," I said. "Perhaps I shall have the pleasure of seeing her later on in the day, or your daughter as well. You remember I congratulated you on your 2 sweethearts." "Yes," he answered, "and you were not far wrong in that. But wouldn't you like to take a turn round the old town first? It's a wonderful place and full of interest, and I know it through and through." I was greatly puzzled by his manner. His speech and address were certainly remarkable for a working man, and I confess that for a moment the thought crossed my mind that he was some sort of impostor, and that I should be well advised to have nothing to do with him. I suppose it was his basket of roses that reassured me. "Well," I said, "I've seen a good deal today, but I've no objection to seeing it all again. I'll put myself in your hands." "Splendid!" he cried. "It's an ideal day, and I'm hungering for sunlight and beauty, and thirsting for the peace of ancient memories, and it will please my wife to know that I've taken you around. What do you say to going up the river first? There's a glorious reach beyond the bridge, and the sun's in the right position to give you the best view of the cathedral." "Nothing would please me better," said I, and we set off at once toward the river. On passing a certain building, he bade me carefully examine the roof, the form of which was remarkable. While I was engaged in so doing, unconscious for a moment of his presence, I suddenly seemed to hear him groan behind me, and turning round I saw that he was holding tight to the iron railings on the other side of the footwalk, and swaying his body backward and forward as though he were in pain. "Are you ill?" I asked, in some alarm. "Not at all. This is just my way of resting when I'm tired. Come along." "That's a splendid lot of roses in your basket," I said, as we took our places in the boat, he sculling and I steering. "Frau Karl Drutzky, unless I'm much mistaken." "Yes, I grew them on my allotment. I'm taking them home to my wife." For some time we talked roses. He had a theory of pruning which differed from mine, and led to a good deal of argument. Finally he dropped his sculls, and taking a piece of paper from his pocket, drew on it the diagram of a rose bush, pruned according to his method. We had forgotten the cathedral. I took his drawing and began to criticize. "Oh," he said, "let's drop it. We're missing one of the noblest sights in England. Look at that!" And he pointed to the heights. As we dropped down the river half an hour later, my companion, who had been silent for some time, again broke out on the subject of roses. "Rose growing is a thing that takes time and patience and thought," he said. "More perhaps than it's worth. If it were not for my wife, I should give it up. She's desperately fond of roses." "That's the best of reasons for not giving it up," I answered. "I happen to be a great admirer of your wife." "That's another link between us," said he. "She's the best wife man ever had. She's worthy of all the admiration you can give her." "She's worthy of all the roses you can grow for her," I said. "By God, she is!" he answered with an emphasis that startled me. We grew confidential, and a story followed. He told me that he was the illegitimate son of a baronet, that his father had made him an allowance to study art in London, that he had married his model in opposition to the wishes of his father, that the baronet had thereupon thrown him over for good and all, that he had failed to make a living by his original art, that he had got an engagement with a great furnishing house as a skilled painter, that he was earning £4 a week in doing artistic work in rich men's houses and elsewhere, that he was now engaged in restoring some 15th century frescoes in a parish church. His wife earned money too, though he did not tell me how, and his daughter was being trained as a singer. "We're all more or less in art," he said, "and we are a very happy family." By this time we were back at the landing place, and as the man stepped ashore, he said, "It's about time I took these roses to my wife. We'll just walk along to where I live, and I'll show you the rest of the sights afterwards. I'll take you to the cathedral when the afternoon service is over." As we walked through the streets, the man kept up an incessant stream of talk, pointing to this and that, and discoursing with great eagerness on the history and antiquities of the town. It struck me as strange that he never waited for an answer, but passed from one thing to another without pause. Presently we stopped in front of a small house, one of a row of villas. "This is where I live," he said, and stopped on the doorstep. "Good!" I cried. "Now you will take me in and reintroduce me to your charming wife." "I'm sorry," he answered, "but the thing's quite impossible." I was so startled by this unexpected answer that, without thinking, I blurted out the question, "Why?" "Because," he said, She's in her coffin. She died at 4 o'clock this morning." At the words, he sank down on his doorstep, put the basket of roses on his knees, and bowed himself over them in a passion of tears. The door opened, and the young girl who had been with me in the train ran down the steps. Sitting down beside her father, she put her arms round his neck and said, "Daddy, Daddy, don't cry." The professor ceased, and there was a long pause. "Did you discover," said the pessimist at length, "why the two were weeping in the train?" "No need to ask that," said our hostess. "The woman had received sentence of death." "Did you ever follow it up?" said the historian. "What, for example, became of the young girl?" "She was married to my eldest son last month," said the professor. "I knew the pessimist's introduction would not be needed," said our host. "Nevertheless, it was the introduction that reminded me of the story," said the professor. "And now," he continued, "can anyone here explain to me the strange conduct of the man with the white roses? For I confess that I can find no place for it in any system of psychology known to me." At this question, the son of the house, who for some reason had become the gravest member of the party, looked up and seemed about to speak. But as he raised his eyes, they met the bright glance of his pretty cousin, on whose cheek there was a tear. And when the son of the house saw that, the impulse to speech died within him. No one else ventured an explanation, but my impression was that there were two persons in the room to whom the strange conduct of the man with the white roses presented no enigma. End of White Roses by L.P.Jacks.